What if I told you that beneath the frozen wilderness of Alaska lies something older and more mysterious than the pyramids of Egypt? Something so dangerous that the government has spent decades covering it up. Tonight, we dive into one of the most chilling conspiracy theories ever documented. The story of the Alaskan Black Pyramid. But first, make sure to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories if you enjoy these stories, and leave your video ideas in the comments below. May 22nd, 1992. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept sipping it anyway. Working the graveyard shift at KTUU Channel 2 in Anchorage wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me access to equipment most people never got to see. I was 24, fresh out of technical college, and convinced I was going to revolutionise broadcast journalism with my keen eye for detail. That night changed everything. The seismograph feeds had been rolling in steady since the China Lake earthquake hit earlier that day. A 7.3 magnitude monster that rattled California and sent shockwaves rippling across the Pacific. Standard procedure was to log the incoming data, file the interesting bits for potential weather segments, and archive the rest. Earthquakes were news, especially big ones, and our meteorologists loved having dramatic seismic readings to show during the morning broadcast. But something was wrong with the Alaska readings. I first noticed it around 3:17 a.m. when the feed from our Fairbanks affiliate came through. The seismograph trace looked nothing like what I'd been seeing from the other stations, where California, Washington, and even Hawaii showed the classic earthquake signature. Sharp initial spikes followed by gradually diminishing aftershocks. The Alaska readings displayed something else entirely. Perfect geometric patterns, symmetrical waves, rhythmic pulses that looked more like a heartbeat than seismic activity. I rewound the tape 3 times, thinking there might be a technical malfunction. But the timestamp was clear. 11:42 p.m, May 22nd, 1992. The same time the China Lake quake reached our monitoring stations. Only this wasn't recording the California earthquake at all. This was something else. Something local. The patterns were too regular, too precise. Natural earthquakes don't pulse in perfect intervals. They don't create mathematical sequences, and they sure as hell don't generate signals that look like someone was transmitting from underground. I made copies of everything. 3 different tapes plus detailed printouts of the most unusual segments. My supervisor, Janet Morrison, would want to see this first thing in the morning. This was the kind of anomaly that could put our little Anchorage station on the national map. When Janet arrived at 6 a.m, I practically ambushed her with my discovery. She listened patiently as I explained the readings, showed her the comparisons between Alaska and the other monitoring stations, and outlined my theory that we'd detected some kind of previously unknown seismic phenomenon. "Interesting," she said, studying the printouts. "Very interesting. Let me make some calls." 2 hours later, Janet returned with news that should have excited me, but instead left me feeling hollow. "False readings," she announced, dropping my carefully organised files into the trash. "Equipment malfunction at the Fairbanks station. They had a power surge that corrupted the incoming data. Happens all the time during major seismic events." "But I checked the logs," I protested. "There's no record of any power problems, and the timestamps." "Are you questioning my sources?" Janet's voice carried a warning I'd never heard before. The geologist at University of Alaska Fairbanks confirmed it personally. Equipment failure. Nothing more. She handed me a new set of tapes. "These are the corrected readings. File them appropriately and forget about the others." I looked at the replacement tapes. Perfect standard earthquake readings. Exactly what you'd expect from the China Lake event. No geometric patterns, no rhythmic pulses, no mathematical sequences, as if the anomalous readings had never existed at all. The next morning brought confirmation that something significant was happening, even if I didn't understand what yet. I arrived at the station to find chaos in the newsroom. Our morning show director, Marcus Webb, was pacing between editing bays while barking orders at anyone within earshot. "Where's the Fairbanks package?" he demanded, stopping in front of my desk. "The geology piece." It was supposed to be ready for the 8 a.m. show. I looked up from the equipment logs I'd been updating. "What geology piece?" "The earthquake follow-up. Fairbanks sent us a segment yesterday evening about unusual readings in the Alaska monitoring stations. Local geologist went on camera discussing the anomalies." My pulse quickened. Someone else had seen what I'd seen. Janet pulled it, came a voice from across the room. Tim Richardson, our weekend anchor, was sorting through a stack of videotapes. Said there were technical issues with the footage. Marcus stormed over to Janet's office, but she wasn't in yet. He returned 20 minutes later, looking frustrated and confused. "Anyone know where I can find this Fairbanks package?" "Misfiled," Tim said, not looking up from his tapes. "At least that's what the overnight producer told me. Said it got mixed in with some promotional materials and accidentally bulk erased." "Accidentally? These things happen, but I knew they didn't. Not like this. Not with footage that corroborated what I'd discovered in the seismograph readings. Video didn't just disappear from a professional news operation, especially not breaking news packages that had been specifically requested for broadcast. I spent my lunch break calling the Fairbanks affiliate, trying to get a copy of the original segment. The receptionist transferred me to 3 different departments before finally connecting me with someone who claimed to handle video archives. "We don't have any record of an earthquake anomaly story," the woman told me. "Are you sure you have the right date?" "May 22nd. Yesterday. A geologist discussing unusual seismograph readings. Let me check again." A long pause filled with keyboard clicking. "I'm sorry, but our only earthquake coverage from yesterday was a brief mention during the evening weather segment. Standard China Lake earthquake information. Nothing about anomalies. But, is there anything else I can help you with?" After she hung up, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, trying to make sense of what was happening. Seismograph recordings didn't just malfunction in perfect geometric patterns. News segments didn't accidentally get erased hours before their scheduled broadcast. And archive departments didn't lose all record of stories that had been produced less than 24 hours earlier. Unless someone wanted them to disappear. When I returned to the station, Janet was waiting at my desk with a folder marked Personnel Review. "We need to talk," she said, gesturing toward her office. The meeting lasted exactly 4 minutes. Janet explained that due to budget constraints, my position would be transitioning from full-time to part-time status. Fewer responsibilities, more focused duties, and significantly less access to incoming feeds and archive materials. "Nothing personal," she assured me, though her eyes suggested otherwise. "Just changing priorities." "Does this have anything to do with the seismograph readings?" Janet's expression hardened. "I told you to forget about that equipment malfunction. Dwelling on minor technical issues isn't productive for anyone." "What if it wasn't a malfunction?" She stood up, clearly ending the conversation. Sometimes the best thing a junior technician can do is trust that his supervisors understand the bigger picture. Focus on your assigned duties. Nothing more. As I left her office, I noticed a man in a grey suit sitting in the lobby. He was reading a newspaper, but his eyes followed me as I walked past. When I glanced back through the window, he was gone. That evening I learned that the Fairbanks geologist who had supposedly been interviewed about the anomalous readings, a Professor Elizabeth Hartman from the University of Alaska, had been transferred to a research position in Antarctica. According to the university's geology department, she'd left Alaska on an urgent research opportunity that morning. 24 hours after the most unusual seismic readings I'd ever documented, everyone involved had either been reassigned, relocated, or convinced that nothing unusual had happened at all. Everyone except me. Summer 1992. The reassignment came through official channels in early June. The Alaska Army National Guard needed civilian technical support for a summer geological survey project in the interior. Good pay, outdoor experience, and the chance to work with sophisticated monitoring equipment. Janet recommended me personally. "Excellent opportunity for professional development," she said, handing me the paperwork. "Military experience looks good on a resume." I should have been suspicious. 2 weeks earlier, I'd been demoted for asking too many questions. Now suddenly I was being recommended for a prestigious assignment with the National Guard. But I was 24 and broke, and the pay was 3 times what I was making at the television station. I signed the papers that afternoon. The briefing session took place at Elmendorf Air Force Base in a windowless room that smelled like industrial carpet and fresh paint. 27 civilian contractors, mostly technical specialists and equipment operators, sat in folding chairs while a lieutenant colonel explained our mission. "Geological survey and magnetic anomaly mapping," he announced, clicking through slides of topographical maps. The US Geological Survey, in cooperation with the Department of Defense, is conducting a comprehensive analysis of the mineral resources and subsurface formations throughout the Tanana Valley region. The map showed a vast area of wilderness roughly 60 miles northeast of Fairbanks. Rugged terrain, limited road access, and according to the briefing materials, significant potential for strategic mineral deposits. Your job is to maintain, calibrate, and monitor an array of sensitive instruments, the Colonel continued. Magnetometers, ground-penetrating radar, seismic sensors, and electromagnetic field detectors. This equipment will provide data essential for mapping subsurface geology and identifying areas of scientific interest. It sounded legitimate, the kind of project the military would undertake to identify valuable resources on federal land. But something about the Colonel's presentation felt rehearsed, as if he was reading from a script rather than explaining a mission he understood. Questions? A contractor in the back row raised his hand. What kind of minerals are we looking for specifically? Rare earth elements, primarily, materials essential for modern electronics and defence applications. Any particular geological formations we should be aware of? The Colonel hesitated for just a moment before answering. Standard sedimentary and igneous formations typical of interior Alaska. Nothing unusual expected. Nothing unusual expected. Phrase would haunt me for years. We were transported to the survey site in military helicopters, flying low over endless miles of boreal forest and tundra. The base camp was more elaborate than I had anticipated. Dozens of green canvas tents, a communications trailer, generator stations, and a helicopter landing pad that could accommodate multiple aircraft simultaneously. This wasn't a typical geological survey. This was a military operation disguised as a scientific mission. My assignment was maintenance and calibration of the electromagnetic monitoring stations. 12 sophisticated units positioned in a rough circle around what the maps labelled as Survey Area Alpha. Each station contained equipment I'd never seen before, devices that looked more like something from a physics laboratory than standard geological instruments. The first anomalous readings appeared on my third day. I was checking the calibration on Station 7, located about 2 miles east of the main camp, when I noticed the electromagnetic sensors were detecting regular pulses from underground. Not random fluctuations or equipment noise, but steady rhythmic signals with a frequency of approximately 0.7 Hz. Like a heartbeat, like something breathing beneath the earth. I ran diagnostics on the equipment, suspecting a malfunction. Everything checked out perfectly. The sensors were operating within normal parameters, accurately detecting electromagnetic pulses originating from somewhere deep below the surface. "Sergeant Williams," I called out to my supervisor, a career Army engineer who'd been surprisingly helpful during my first few days. "I'm getting some unusual readings on the EM array." He walked over and studied the display screens, his expression growing more serious as he examined the data. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "Started about an hour ago. Regular pulses, subsurface origin, consistent frequency." Williams made some notes in his field logbook, then spent several minutes adjusting settings and running his own diagnostics. "Equipment's working fine," he concluded. "Must be picking up some kind of geological phenomenon." "What kind of geological phenomenon generates regular electromagnetic pulses?" He closed his logbook and looked at me directly. "The kind we're here to study." That night, lying in my tent and listening to the generators humming in the distance, I realised that Sergeant Williams had given me the first honest answer I'd received since arriving in Alaska. We weren't here to survey for minerals or map geological formations. We were here to monitor something that was already known to exist. Something that pulsed with mechanical regularity deep beneath the Alaskan wilderness. Something that had probably been responsible for the anomalous seismograph readings I'd discovered 3 months earlier at the television station. Over the following weeks, the electromagnetic readings grew stronger and more complex. What had started as simple pulses evolved into intricate patterns, sequences of signals that repeated every few hours with mathematical precision. I began keeping detailed logs, documenting frequency variations, amplitude changes, and the seemingly deliberate nature of the signal patterns. Other contractors started reporting similar anomalies. Ground-penetrating radar detected vast structural formations at depths that should have contained nothing but rock and sediment. Magnetometers recorded field disturbances that followed geometric arrangements. Seismic sensors picked up vibrations that sounded almost like machinery operating far underground. But whenever we tried to discuss our findings with supervisory personnel, we received the same response. Log the data and continue monitoring. Analysis will be conducted at higher levels. By late July, it became clear that we weren't the first team to work this area. During a routine maintenance check at Station 11, I discovered survey markers that predated our mission by at least 5 years. Weathered metal stakes marked with coordinates and reference numbers, partially buried in the permafrost. Someone had been monitoring this region for a long time. Someone had known exactly what we would find. The discovery happened on August 15th, during what should have been a routine equipment check. I was assigned to the night shift that week, monitoring the sensor array while the day crew focused on expanding the survey perimeter. It was lonely work, 6 hours alone with nothing but instrument panels and radio chatter from the main camp, but I'd grown to appreciate the solitude. The midnight hours in Alaska were never truly dark during summer, just a prolonged twilight that painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber. Station 9 had been acting up for 3 days, showing intermittent power fluctuations that didn't appear to have any mechanical cause. The generators were running smoothly, the cable connections were solid, and diagnostic tests showed all systems operating normally. But every few hours the station would experience a brief power surge followed by a momentary blackout. Sergeant Williams had asked me to babysit the problem station overnight, documenting any irregularities and performing manual resets when necessary. Boring work, but it gave me time to study the data logs I'd been accumulating over the past month. The electromagnetic pulse patterns had become increasingly complex. What started as simple, rhythmic signals had evolved into sequences that almost resembled coded transmissions. Mathematical progressions, repeated intervals, and variations that suggested some kind of underlying intelligence. I was reviewing frequency analyses when the ground started vibrating. Not earthquake vibrations. I'd experienced enough of those during my time in Alaska to recognize the difference. This was more subtle, a deep thrumming that seemed to emanate from directly beneath the monitoring station. The vibrations lasted exactly 43 seconds, then stopped as abruptly as they'd begun. Station 9's equipment went crazy. Every sensor simultaneously spiked into the red zone. Electromagnetic readings jumped to levels I'd never seen before. The seismic detectors registered movement equivalent to a magnitude 3.0 earthquake, but only from this specific location. Ground-penetrating radar showed massive structural movement at depths approaching 200 feet. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything returned to normal. I radioed the main camp immediately, but the communications officer seemed unconcerned. Probably just a minor tremor, he said. Log it and continue monitoring. But I knew it wasn't a tremor. Earthquakes don't affect just one monitoring station, while leaving others completely undisturbed. They don't create perfect geometric signatures on electromagnetic sensors, and they sure as hell don't last exactly 43 seconds with mechanical precision. An hour later I saw lights moving on the restricted ridge. About half a mile north of Station 9, a steep hillside had been declared off-limits to survey personnel from the beginning of our mission. Official designation: Geological Hazard Area, Unstable Slope Conditions. We'd been instructed to stay at least 500 yards away from the base of the ridge and report any signs of erosion or rockfall activity. But now, at 2:30 in the morning, powerful floodlights were illuminating the entire slope. I grabbed the night vision binoculars from my equipment kit and focused on the ridge. Military vehicles, at least 4 heavy trucks and what looked like a bulldozer, were positioned around the base of the hill. Dozens of personnel moved back and forth in the artificial daylight, carrying equipment I couldn't identify. They appeared to be excavating something. For the next 3 hours I watched them work. The bulldozer cleared away loose rock and debris while teams of specialists used smaller tools to carefully expose whatever lay beneath. It was methodical, professional work that suggested they knew exactly what they were looking for. At 5:47 a.m. they uncovered it. Even through the binoculars, even at a distance of nearly half a mile, there was no mistaking what had been hidden beneath the collapsed slope. A smooth, triangular face of black material jutted from the hillside. Not rough stone or natural rock formation, but a perfectly flat surface that seemed to absorb the floodlight beams rather than reflect them. The exposed section was roughly 20 feet wide at the base and extended upward into the hill at a precise geometric angle. It looked like the tip of something much larger buried beneath the ridge, something artificial, something deliberately constructed, something that had been generating electromagnetic pulses beneath the Alaskan wilderness. I fumbled for my camera, desperately trying to document what I was seeing, but by the time I managed to focus the telephoto lens, heavy canvas tarps were being stretched over the excavation site. Within minutes, the entire operation disappeared beneath military green coverings. The floodlights went out, the vehicles withdrew. By sunrise, the ridge looked exactly as it had when I'd arrived at Station 9 8 hours earlier. Except now I knew what was hidden underneath. When Sergeant Williams arrived for the morning shift change, I tried to explain what I'd witnessed. He listened patiently while I described the excavation, the exposed black surface, and the obvious artificial nature of whatever lay buried in the ridge. "Interesting," he said when I finished my report. "But you were supposed to be monitoring Station 9, not conducting unauthorized surveillance of restricted areas. The lights were impossible to miss, and if there's some kind of structure buried out there, it might explain the electromagnetic anomalies we've been detecting." Williams made notes in his field logbook, just as he had when I'd first reported the unusual readings weeks earlier, but his expression suggested he was recording my observations rather than investigating them. "I'll pass your report up the chain of command," he assured me. "Meanwhile, I need you to focus on your assigned duties. The equipment monitoring is critical to our mission success." "But what about the excavation? Shouldn't we be coordinating with whoever was working on the ridge?" "That's above your clearance level." His tone carried the same warning I'd heard from Janet Morrison months earlier at the television station. Sometimes the best thing a contractor can do is trust that the people in charge understand the bigger picture. I spent the rest of that morning reviewing my camera footage and detailed notes from the night shift. Everything I'd witnessed was carefully documented. Timestamps, coordinates, descriptions of equipment and personnel, detailed observations of the exposed black surface. Physical evidence that something extraordinary was buried beneath the Alaska wilderness. When I returned to Station 9 that evening, the restricted ridge had been completely transformed. Fresh dirt covered the excavation site. New warning signs marked the perimeter of the off-limits zone, and a guard post had been established at the base of the hill, manned by 2 soldiers who remained visible throughout the night. Lieutenant Torres, who supervised the evening security rotation, stopped by my monitoring station around midnight. "Any problems with the equipment tonight?" he asked. "Everything's running smoothly." "Good. By the way, yesterday's excavation work on the ridge was just routine geological sampling. Foundation testing for a possible communications relay tower. Nothing that would affect your monitoring duties." He waited for me to acknowledge his explanation. "Understood," I said, but I didn't understand. Communications relay towers don't require exposing smooth black surfaces that absorb light. Geological sampling doesn't involve covering excavation sites with military tarps and posting armed guards. And foundation testing sure as hell doesn't explain electromagnetic pulse patterns that had been detected for months before any excavation began. 3 days later, I learned that my security clearance had been upgraded. Additional background checks, expanded access to classified materials, and a significant increase in my daily pay rate. I should have been excited about the promotion. Instead, I felt like I was being bought, and I was probably right. The warnings started trickling in during late August, passed along through the informal network of hunters, trappers, and bush pilots who made their living in the Alaska interior. Jerry Kowalski was the first to approach me directly. A hunting guide from Healy who'd been working the region for 15 years, he found me during a supply run to the nearest trading post and pulled me aside for a conversation that changed everything. "You boys are stirring up something that ought to be left alone," he said, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "Local folks are getting nervous." "What do you mean?" "Equipment failures, vehicles breaking down for no reason, compasses spinning like tops when you get within 5 miles of your operation." Jerry described incidents that had been occurring with increasing frequency since our survey mission began. Hunters reporting complete electrical system failures in their trucks after driving past our access roads. Bush pilots experiencing instrument malfunctions while flying over the Tanana Valley region. Even handheld GPS units and basic magnetic compasses becoming unreliable anywhere near our survey area. "Started about the same time you military boys showed up," he continued, "getting worse every week. You think our equipment is causing interference?" Jerry laughed, but there was no humour in it. "Son, I've been around industrial operations my whole life. Mining camps, construction projects, military exercises. Never seen anything that could drain a truck battery from 2 miles away." He handed me a photograph, an aerial shot of the valley taken from his small plane the previous week. In the image, our survey stations were clearly visible, as small dots arranged in what appeared to be a perfect circle around the restricted ridge. 12 stations, Jerry said, equal spacing. Mathematical precision. That's not how you set up equipment for mineral surveys. He was right. Standard geological surveys used irregular patterns based on topographical features and suspected resource locations. Our array looked more like something designed to monitor or contain a specific area. "What do you think we're really doing out there?" Jerry studied my face for a long moment before answering. "Same thing the government's been doing in Alaska for decades, poking around in places that ought to be left alone. Over the next 2 weeks I began seeking out other locals who might have information about unusual activities in the region. What I discovered was a pattern of strange incidents, dating back years before our current mission. Margaret Yates, who operated a small airfield near Nenana, remembered military helicopters conducting nighttime flights to the Tanana Valley throughout the late 1980s. Always the same destination, always carrying equipment and personnel, always operating under radio silence. They'd fuel up here sometimes, she told me. Never talked to anyone, never explained where they were going. But they always flew to the same coordinates, and they always came back before dawn. Tom Bradley, a trapper who'd been working the region since the 1970s, described discovering survey markers and abandoned equipment caches years before any official geological mission had been announced. Found metal stakes with government markings back in '87, he said. Somebody was mapping that area long before you boys showed up. Most disturbing were the accounts from native residents of nearby villages. Elders spoke of the hum beneath the earth that had been growing stronger over the past decade. Traditional hunting grounds where caribou and other wildlife had begun avoiding certain areas. Stories passed down through generations about the thing that sleeps under the ice. Anna Tutu, a respected elder from the village of Minto, agreed to meet with me after hearing about my questions from other community members. "My grandfather told stories about that place," she said. "Long before any white men came to Alaska, there was something buried in the earth. Something that wasn't supposed to be disturbed." "What kind of something?" Anna looked toward the distant mountains where our survey mission was operating. He called it the star that fell and stayed. Said it was older than the ice, older than the trees. Said the shamans used to keep people away from that place because it could change the way you think. Change how? Make you forget what's real. Make you see things that aren't there. Make you believe lies were truth. I thought about the months I'd spent documenting anomalous readings, only to have supervisors explain them away as equipment malfunctions. The seismograph recordings that had been replaced with corrected versions. The news segments that had disappeared from archive systems. Make you believe lies were truth. "The old stories say it would call to certain people," Anna continued. "Draw them closer. Make them want to dig it up and set it free." "Set what free?" "Whatever's been sleeping under the ground all this time." As summer turned toward autumn, the reports from local residents became increasingly alarming. Commercial pilots were reporting instrument failures and navigation problems over a widening area around our survey site. The Alaska State Troopers received multiple complaints about electronic device malfunctions near what was supposed to be a routine geological survey. Most significantly, several hunting parties had reported visual phenomena that defied explanation. Dave Richardson and his son Michael were bow hunting for moose about 8 miles south of our operation when they witnessed what Dave described as lights moving underground. Not surface lights, he emphasised when I interviewed him at his home in Fairbanks. These were coming from beneath the forest floor. Geometric patterns moving in straight lines, like somebody was running electric cables under the trees. How long did this last? About 20 minutes, then everything went dark and our truck wouldn't start. Batteries were completely drained. Michael, who was studying electrical engineering at the University of Alaska, had brought a digital camera on the hunting trip. When they tried to review the photographs later, every image taken during the time period when they'd witnessed the underground lights had been corrupted. Not just overexposed or blurry, Michael explained. The files were there, but they contained nothing but static patterns, like something had scrambled the digital data. By September, enough local residents had experienced unusual phenomena that the issue reached the attention of state government offices in Anchorage. According to Jerry Kowalski, who had contacts in the Alaska legislature, several state representatives had submitted formal inquiries about military activities in the Tanana Valley region. The official response was always the same: routine geological survey operations conducted in cooperation with the US Geological Survey. No classified activities, no unusual equipment, no cause for public concern. But the locals knew better. They'd seen the effects, witnessed the phenomena, and experienced the equipment failures that seemed to radiate outward from our survey area, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. And some of them had begun to piece together the bigger picture. "You want to know what I think you boys found out there?" Jerry asked during our last conversation before I left Alaska. "I think you found something that's been buried for a long, long time. Something that maybe should have stayed buried. What makes you say that? Because 40 years ago, my father was hunting in that same area when the army first started poking around. Same kind of operation, same kind of secrecy. He said the old-timers back then called it feeding the thing in the ground. Feeding it? Power. Attention. People digging around and trying to wake it up." Jerry looked toward the mountains where our survey mission continued its work. Problem is, some things are buried for a good reason. And once you start digging them up, you can't always put them back. As I prepared to leave Alaska and return to civilian life, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jerry's warning was more prophetic than I'd realized. We hadn't just discovered something extraordinary buried beneath the wilderness. We'd awakened it. The first sign that my civilian life wouldn't be returning to normal came 3 days after I arrived back in Anchorage. I'd returned to my old job at KTUU Channel 2, accepting a significant pay cut and the same limited access that had been imposed before my National Guard assignment. Janet Morrison acted as if nothing unusual had happened, welcoming me back with professional courtesy and a stack of routine technical duties. But I wasn't the same person who'd left Alaska 4 months earlier. I'd seen too much, documented too many anomalies, and accumulated too much evidence to simply resume my old life pretending that nothing extraordinary was happening beneath the Alaskan wilderness. My plan was simple: use the television station's archive resources to compile a comprehensive record of everything I'd discovered. Seismograph recordings, electromagnetic readings, photographic evidence, and testimonies from local residents. If I could document the pattern of unusual activities dating back to the 1980s, maybe I could piece together the full scope of whatever the government was trying to hide. The first obstacle appeared immediately. Station 9's data logs, the detailed records I'd maintained throughout the summer survey mission, were classified as government property and had been confiscated before I left the base camp. Standard procedure, according to Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who supervised our mission debriefing. All documentation related to the geological survey falls under federal security protocols, he explained. Contractor personnel are not authorized to retain copies of operational data. I'd expected this, which is why I'd hidden duplicate copies of my most important observations. Nothing official or comprehensive, just personal notes and sketches that I'd kept in my civilian gear rather than military-issued equipment. But when I unpacked my belongings at my apartment in Anchorage, those materials were missing too. The box containing my handwritten logs, electromagnetic frequency charts, and detailed sketches of the black surface I'd observed on the ridge had been replaced with standard National Guard paperwork. Personnel evaluation forms, equipment checkout lists, and administrative materials that any contractor would be expected to possess. No evidence that I'd witnessed anything unusual during my 4 months in the wilderness. I filed a formal complaint with the National Guard Administrative Office, claiming that my personal property had been accidentally switched with someone else's materials. The response came back within 48 hours, no record of any missing civilian property, and no other contractor personnel reporting similar issues. According to their files, I'd never maintained any personal documentation beyond standard administrative paperwork. My second attempt to reconstruct the evidence focused on the television station's archive system. KTUU had been monitoring seismograph feeds from across Alaska for over a decade, and I was certain that other unusual readings had been recorded during the months preceding my National Guard assignment. But when I accessed the seismograph archives, I discovered that the files for July through September 1992 had been updated with a notation I'd never seen before. Reprocessed per USNO guidance. Original data archived off-site. The corrected files contained exactly what I expected to find. Standard seismic readings with no unusual patterns, no geometric signatures, and no evidence of electromagnetic anomalies. Clean, normal data that showed nothing more interesting than routine earthquake activity and background geological noise. The original recordings I'd discovered back in May, the ones showing rhythmic pulses and mathematical sequences, had been completely replaced. "What's USNO?" I asked Janet Morrison during our weekly staff meeting. "United States Naval Observatory," she replied without looking up from her scheduling notes. "They provide technical guidance for precision timing and navigation systems. Sometimes they issue corrections for data that's been corrupted by equipment malfunctions." Equipment malfunctions? Civilian monitoring stations aren't always calibrated to military standards. The observatory helps ensure accuracy when federal agencies need reliable seismic data. Janet's explanation sounded reasonable, but it didn't address the fundamental question. Why would the Naval Observatory care about routine earthquake readings from Alaska television stations? Unless those readings weren't routine at all. My investigation stalled completely in October when I attempted to contact the Fairbanks geologist who'd supposedly been interviewed about the seismograph anomalies, Professor Elizabeth Hartman, who had been transferred to Antarctica the day after the China Lake earthquake. According to the University of Alaska, Professor Hartman had never been employed by their geology department. No record of her teaching any classes, conducting research, or holding any position at the university. No academic publications, no research grants, no professional affiliations with any Alaska-based scientific institutions. Elizabeth Hartman had never existed. But someone had been interviewed by the Fairbanks television station about unusual seismic readings. Someone with sufficient credentials to be presented as a local geology expert. Someone whose segment had been scheduled for broadcast before mysteriously disappearing from the archive system. I spent weeks trying to identify who might have been interviewed, contacting geology departments throughout Alaska, and searching academic databases for researchers who might have been working in the region during 1992. Nothing. No geologist, no interview, no evidence that any news segment about seismic anomalies had ever been produced. Yet I distinctly remembered Tim Richardson mentioning the Fairbanks package and Marcus Webb searching for the missing footage. Either multiple people at the television station shared the same false memory, or we'd all witnessed evidence that had been systematically erased. The final piece of proof that my experiences were being actively suppressed came in November, when I received an official notice from the Alaska Army National Guard. All personnel who had participated in the summer 1992 geological survey were required to attend a mandatory debriefing session at Elmendorf Air Force Base. Attendance was not optional, and failure to appear would result in legal action under the terms of our contractor agreements. 26 of the original 27 civilian contractors attended the session. The missing person, a magnetometer specialist named Carl Henderson, had been killed in a car accident 2 weeks after returning to civilian life. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes conducted the debriefing personally, explaining that some of our survey data had been misinterpreted by personnel without appropriate technical training. Electromagnetic readings that appeared anomalous were actually the result of solar storm activity and atmospheric interference. Ground-penetrating radar signatures that seemed artificial were caused by natural mineral deposits and geological formations. Everything we'd witnessed had a perfectly reasonable scientific explanation. Some of you may have observed excavation activities near restricted areas, Hayes continued. This was routine slope stabilization work to prevent erosion that could damage our monitoring equipment. He made eye contact with me specifically when he said this. All survey data remains classified for national security reasons. Personnel are reminded that their contractor agreements include permanent non-disclosure provisions regarding any activities observed during the mission. The meeting concluded with each contractor signing an updated security agreement. The document contained language I didn't remember from our original paperwork, specific clauses prohibiting public discussion of survey activities, with civil and criminal penalties for violations. When I raised questions about the revised terms, Hayes assured me that this was standard procedure for all government geological surveys. Nothing personal, he said, echoing Janet Morrison's words from months earlier, just changing security requirements. But as I signed the papers, I noticed that my original contractor file had been modified. According to the updated records, I'd been assigned to routine equipment maintenance duties throughout the mission. No mention of electromagnetic monitoring, no record of anomalous readings, no documentation of my reports about the excavation on the restricted ridge. My summer in the Alaska wilderness had been reduced to 4 months of mundane technical work with no unusual incidents, as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened at all. Late 1990s, for 5 years after the debriefing, I tried to forget what I'd witnessed in the Tanana Valley. I focused on my work at the television station, avoided discussions about unusual seismic activity, and convinced myself that Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had been right about misinterpreted data and natural explanations. But the whispers never stopped completely. They came through informal networks, conversations overheard in bars, rumours passed along by military personnel on leave, cryptic references and technical journals that hinted at classified research projects in remote locations. In 1997, I moved to Fairbanks and took a position with a private communications company that serviced rural Alaska. The work involved maintaining radio relay stations and satellite communication equipment throughout the interior, which gave me opportunities to travel through the same regions where I'd worked during my National Guard assignment. The Tanana Valley looked different now. New access roads, expanded helicopter landing areas, and permanent structures that hadn't existed during our 1992 survey mission. According to local residents, military activity in the region had increased significantly over the past few years. But when I tried to obtain information about current operations through official channels, I encountered the same bureaucratic walls that had frustrated me 5 years earlier. The area remained classified as an active geological research zone with restricted public access. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source. Roger Eastman, a retired Westinghouse engineer who'd spent 3 decades working on classified defence projects. I met Roger during a technical conference in Anchorage, where he was presenting research on electromagnetic field detection systems. After his presentation, we ended up sharing drinks at the hotel bar and discussing the challenges of maintaining sensitive equipment in Alaska's harsh environment. "You know," Roger said after his 3rd beer, "Cheyenne Mountain has NORAD, but Alaska has something much older. We're just plugging our systems into it." "What do you mean?" Roger glanced around the bar, making sure we weren't being overheard. "Ever hear of Project Deep Freeze?" I hadn't. 1950s, he continued. Antarctic research program officially. But there were parallel operations in Alaska that never made it into the public record. Government found something buried in the permafrost. Something that had been there for a very long time. What kind of something? Artificial structure, massive, pre-existing power generation capabilities that our best engineers couldn't explain. Roger finished his beer and signalled for another. Westinghouse got the contract to interface our monitoring systems with whatever the hell was already down there. "You're talking about the Tanana Valley region?" Roger's expression sobered immediately. "I never mentioned any specific locations. And neither did you. But his confirmation was clear enough. For over 40 years, the US government had been operating some kind of facility that utilised technology they didn't fully understand. Technology that had been discovered rather than developed. Technology that generated the electromagnetic pulses I'd monitored during the summer of 1992. Over the following months, I began documenting similar accounts from other retired defence contractors and former military personnel. Always the same pattern. Classified projects involving pre-existing structures, technology that exceeded contemporary capabilities, and strict security protocols that prevented public disclosure. In 1999, I submitted Freedom of Information Act requests for any documents related to geological surveys, electromagnetic monitoring, or military activities in the Tanana Valley region between 1987 and 1995. The response arrived 8 months later, 247 pages of heavily redacted documents that contained virtually no useful information. Every significant detail had been blacked out under national security exemptions, leaving only basic administrative data like dates, personnel assignments, and equipment inventories. But even the censored documents revealed important patterns. Military operations in the region had been continuous since at least 1987, not sporadic survey missions as I'd been led to believe. Multiple federal agencies were involved, including the Department of Energy, NASA, and organisations I'd never heard of with acronyms that suggested advanced research activities. Most significantly, the equipment inventories listed sophisticated monitoring and communication systems that far exceeded what would be necessary for routine geological surveys. Power generation capabilities, satellite uplink systems, and electromagnetic field manipulation devices that suggested the kind of advanced research Roger Eastman had described. The government wasn't just studying whatever lay buried beneath the Alaska wilderness, they were actively using it. 2003. The photograph arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered to my P.O. box in Fairbanks with no return address and no postmark indicating its origin. I'd maintained the anonymous mail drop for 6 years, using it primarily for correspondence related to my ongoing research into the Alaska operations. Most of the mail consisted of responses to FOIA requests, academic papers related to electromagnetic phenomena, and occasional letters from other researchers who'd heard about my interest in unusual geological activities. But this package was different. No return address, no postal markings, and a weight that suggested something more substantial than typical correspondence. When I opened it at home, I found a single aerial photograph with a handwritten note attached. The image showed the Tanana Valley region from an altitude of approximately 10,000 feet. Someone had used a red pencil to mark specific locations throughout the valley. 12 points arranged in a perfect circle around the restricted ridge where I'd witnessed the excavation 11 years earlier. The marked locations corresponded exactly to the monitoring stations our survey team had established during the summer of 1992. But this photograph hadn't been taken during our mission. The image clearly showed permanent structures, access roads, and facilities that hadn't existed when I was working in the region. According to the date stamp in the corner, the photograph had been taken less than 6 months earlier. The handwritten note was brief. Energy is not created, it is channeled. Keep quiet. No signature, no identification of the sender, no explanation of how they'd obtained my mailing address or why they'd chosen to share this information with me. But the message was clear enough. Someone with access to recent surveillance data wanted me to understand that the operations I'd witnessed were part of a much larger and ongoing project. I studied the photograph for hours, using magnifying equipment to examine every detail. The permanent structures included what appeared to be a substantial underground facility, with only ventilation systems and communication equipment visible at the surface level. Multiple helicopter landing areas, underground power lines, and security installations that suggested a major military operation. This wasn't a research station or monitoring facility. This was a full-scale industrial complex built around whatever lay buried beneath the ridge. 3 days after receiving the photograph, I was contacted by a man who identified himself only as a government liaison. He called while I was at work, somehow obtaining my direct office number despite the fact that my employment with the communications company wasn't a matter of public record. "We need to meet," he said without preamble. "Tonight, 7 p.m, the parking lot behind the Westmark Hotel." Who is this? Someone who can help you understand your situation. What situation? The one that's been developing since you started asking questions about geological surveys and electromagnetic monitoring. The line went dead before I could respond. I should have ignored the call. Every instinct warned me that meeting with anonymous government contacts was dangerous, especially given my history with classified operations and security agreements. But I'd been searching for answers for over a decade. This might be my only opportunity to learn the truth about what I'd witnessed in the Alaska wilderness. The man was waiting in a dark sedan when I arrived at the hotel parking lot. He gestured for me to get in the passenger seat, but kept the engine running throughout our conversation. "You received a package this week," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Interesting photograph. Someone obviously wants you to understand that your 1992 experiences were part of a larger operation." "Are they?" He handed me a manila envelope. "There are two ways this conversation can end. Option 1, you accept a consulting fee of $50,000, sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, and relocate outside Alaska within 60 days. And Option 2 involves a much more complicated legal situation that wouldn't be pleasant for anyone involved." I opened the envelope. It contained a cashier's check made out to my name, along with a stack of legal documents that appeared to be updated security agreements with significantly more restrictive terms than anything I'd signed previously. What exactly am I agreeing not to discuss? Geological phenomena that could be misinterpreted by the public, national security activities that require operational security, research projects that might be misunderstood without appropriate scientific context. Research into what? The man studied my face in the dim light from the dashboard. "How much do you really want to know? Because once you cross that line, there's no going back to your normal life." I thought about the past 11 years, the missing data, the revised records, the systematic erasure of everything I'd witnessed during my National Guard assignment, the electromagnetic pulses that defied explanation, the black surface that absorbed light, and the whispered warnings from local residents about things that should be left buried. "I want to know the truth." He reached into his jacket and handed me a second set of documents. These weren't security agreements or legal contracts, but photocopied pages from what appeared to be scientific reports. "The structure under the ridge is approximately 900 feet long," he said as I scanned the documents. "Triangular cross-section, composed of materials that don't match any known geological formations. Carbon dating suggests it's been there for at least 12,000 years. 12,000 years? Long before any known civilization had the technology to construct something like this, the electromagnetic pulses you monitored are generated by systems we still don't understand. Power output equivalent to a small nuclear reactor, but no identifiable energy source." I read through the scientific reports, trying to comprehend the implications of what he was telling me. The structure wasn't just large, it was massive, larger than any pyramid ever built by human civilization, buried beneath the Alaska wilderness for millennia. "What is it?" "We don't know, but we've been learning how to use it." He explained that the government had been channeling the structure's energy output to power classified research facilities throughout Alaska and northwestern Canada. The monitoring stations I'd helped establish were part of a grid system that regulated and directed the electromagnetic pulses for military and scientific applications. "Free energy," he continued, "clean, unlimited, and completely undetectable by conventional monitoring systems. It's revolutionizing everything from satellite communications to advanced weapons research. And the people who live in the region? The equipment failures, the health effects, acceptable risks for a project of this magnitude." The casual dismissal of civilian safety was disturbing, but not surprising given the scope of the operation he was describing. If the government had discovered a source of unlimited energy, they would certainly prioritize military applications over public welfare. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you've been persistent enough to become a security risk, but smart enough to be useful. We need technical personnel who understand both the capabilities and the security requirements of this project." He handed me a business card with nothing but a phone number printed on it. "Think about it for 48 hours, then call that number and let us know your decision. Accept the consulting fee and relocation offer, or become part of something much bigger than anything you've imagined." As I left the parking lot that night, I realised that my search for answers had led to a choice I'd never anticipated. I could take the money, sign the agreements, and spend the rest of my life pretending that nothing extraordinary existed beneath the Alaska wilderness. Or I could join the people who were actively exploiting whatever lay buried in the permafrost, regardless of the consequences for the world above. I never called the number. Instead, I kept the photograph and destroyed everything else: the check, the legal documents, and the business card with its anonymous contact information. Within a week, my P.O. box was burglarized and my office computer was stolen during a break-in that police described as random vandalism. The message was clear: Cooperation or silence were my only options. I chose silence, but not surrender. For the past 20 years, I've continued monitoring the situation from a distance. Small news items about equipment failures near the Tanana Valley, occasional reports of unusual seismic activity in interior Alaska, and academic papers discussing electromagnetic anomalies that are quickly withdrawn from publication. The signs are always the same. Something massive continues operating beneath the Alaska wilderness, generating power and pulses that ripple through the surrounding region like a heartbeat under the earth. The government's cover stories have evolved over the decades. Geological surveys became climate research stations, which became renewable energy projects, which became atmospheric monitoring facilities. But the fundamental operation remains unchanged. A massive artificial structure of unknown origin providing unlimited energy for classified military applications. Local residents still report the same phenomena I witnessed during my National Guard assignment. Electronic devices failing without explanation, compasses spinning uselessly, and the persistent low-frequency hum that seems to emanate from deep underground. Anna Sutu was right about the old stories. Something sleeps beneath the ice, something older than human civilization, something that was never meant to be disturbed. But we've been disturbing it for over half a century now, feeding it our attention and technology, learning to harness its power for purposes its builders never intended. And with each passing year, the electromagnetic pulses grow stronger, the affected area grows larger, and the hum beneath the earth grows more insistent. Sometimes, when commercial flights pass over the region at night, passengers report seeing geometric patterns of light moving beneath the forest canopy. Airlines dismiss these sightings as atmospheric phenomena or aurora activity, but I know better. Those lights are coming from the structure itself, radiating upward through hundreds of feet of rock and permafrost, marking the boundaries of something that extends far beyond what any government survey has officially acknowledged. The Alaska Black Pyramid, because that's what it is, regardless of what the scientists and engineers choose to call it, isn't just a source of free energy. It's a machine, a device, a technology so advanced that we're still just scratching the surface of its capabilities after decades of study. And after 20 years of silence, I'm finally ready to speak. They buried the evidence, relocated the witnesses, and rewrote the official records. But they couldn't erase what thousands of Alaska residents have experienced firsthand. They couldn't suppress every photograph, silence every contractor, or explain away every electromagnetic anomaly. The truth is still there, humming beneath the permafrost, generating power for projects we're not supposed to know about, radiating effects that grow stronger every year. Something larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza sleeps under Alaska, and it's been awake for a very long time. Welcome to Sleep Theories, where we explore the stories that keep you awake at night. Before we dive into today's tale, I want to thank Galletti Productions for suggesting this chilling narrative. If you have ideas for future stories, please leave them in the comments below. And if you enjoy these dark tales, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more content that will make you question everything you think you know about our world. What you're about to hear is a first-person account that surfaced on various encrypted forums before mysteriously disappearing. The narrator's identity remains unknown. Some claim it's fiction, others believe it's a warning. You'll have to decide for yourself. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I found, and what it cost me to share it with the world. 6 months ago, I was just another face in the cubicle farm, a mid-level data analyst working for Meridian Consulting, a contractor that specialised in processing documentation for various United Nations partner agencies. It was boring work, the kind that pays the bills but doesn't exactly inspire water cooler conversations. My job was simple. Take massive folders of open source documents related to sustainable development goals and organise them into digestible reports for policymakers. Climate data, poverty statistics, education metrics, all the dry stuff that makes the world go round, theoretically. I'd been doing it for 3 years, long enough to recognise the patterns, long enough to know when something didn't belong. It was a Tuesday morning in March when everything changed. I was working through my usual queue of files when a new folder appeared in my secure inbox. SDG Compliance. Phase 3, internal use only. The timestamp showed it had been uploaded at 3:47 a.m, which struck me as odd. Most of our documentation came through during business hours, properly labelled and categorised. I should have flagged it immediately. Protocol dictated that any file marked internal use only should be forwarded to my supervisor without opening. But curiosity killed more than just cats, and I'd always been too curious for my own good. The folder contained 47 documents, most of them PDFs with official UN letterheads. At first glance they looked legitimate: charts, graphs, policy recommendations. But as I scrolled through the first document, something felt wrong. The language was different from the usual bureaucratic speak I was used to processing. Instead of vague references to sustainable urban development, I found detailed maps showing what were labelled as population consolidation zones. Major cities were divided into coloured sections. Green zones marked compliant residential areas, yellow zones labelled transition monitoring required, and red zones ominously tagged relocation priority. My hands trembled as I opened the second document. It was a spreadsheet titled Behavioural Compliance Credits, Phase 3 Implementation. Each row represented a different category of human activity: private vehicle ownership, meat consumption, energy usage, travel frequency. Next to each category were point values, negative numbers that would be deducted from something called a citizenship score. The third document made my stomach drop. It was a timeline, meticulously planned and colour-coded, with one phrase repeated at the top of every page: Target year 2030. The timeline started in 2025 with Phase 1 Infrastructure Digitisation. Banking systems, identification cards, payment processing, everything would be converted to digital platforms with mandatory government oversight. Phase 2, scheduled for 2027, was labelled Voluntary Compliance Incentivisation. Tax breaks and social benefits would be tied to behaviour modification programmes. But Phase 3, set for 2029, sent chills down my spine. Mandatory compliance enforcement. Citizens who failed to meet behavioural standards would lose access to housing subsidies, food distribution networks, and healthcare services. The document coldly referred to this as natural selection through administrative channels. I found myself reading the same sentences over and over, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. The United Nations was supposed to be about humanitarian aid and international cooperation, not population control and behavioural manipulation. But the documents were too detailed, too specific to be fake. They referenced real programs I'd seen in previous reports: smart city initiatives in Toronto, digital identity pilots in Amsterdam, carbon credit systems being tested in Singapore. All of it was presented as voluntary, progressive and environmentally conscious. But according to these files, it was all preparation for something much darker. The final document in the folder was a memo dated just 2 weeks earlier. It was addressed to regional coordination directors and signed by someone with the title Under-Secretary for Compliance Architecture. The subject line read, Accelerated Timeline Approval, Operation Sustainable Transition. Colleagues, it began, recent global events have provided us with an unprecedented opportunity to advance our timeline. Public acceptance of monitoring and restriction measures has exceeded projections by 340%. We are therefore moving to implement Phase 3 protocols 18 months ahead of schedule. All regional coordinators should prepare their populations for the transition to mandatory compliance by Q4 2029. Remember, this is not about control, it is about survival. The planet cannot sustain current consumption patterns. We are the shepherds of a new era. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. The cursor blinked in the search bar, waiting for my next move. Around me, my colleagues continued their work, oblivious to what I'd stumbled across. The hum of fluorescent lights seemed suddenly oppressive, the click of keyboards ominous. I glanced at the clock. 11:23 a.m. In a few hours I'd have to log this file in our system, noting what I'd reviewed and any relevant findings. But what exactly had I found? evidence of the most elaborate conspiracy in human history, or the fevered imagination of someone with too much time and access to official letterhead templates. My supervisor, Janet Morrison, walked past my cubicle, coffee mug in hand. She smiled and nodded, the same greeting she'd given me every day for 3 years. Should I tell her what I'd found? Should I forward the files and let someone else make the decision? Instead, I did something that would change my life forever. I opened a new email and began typing, "Janet, I've received a file folder that appears to be outside my clearance level. The documents reference programs and timelines that I believe require senior review. Should I forward this to you, or is there a specific protocol for handling classified materials that I'm not aware of? Please advise. Mark." I read the email 3 times before hitting send. It was professional, cautious, and documented my discovery without making accusations. If this was all legitimate, I'd followed proper channels. If it wasn't, well, at least I'd have a paper trail showing I'd tried to do the right thing. The email showed as delivered at 11:31 a.m. I saved the documents to a secure folder on my desktop and logged out for lunch, trying to act normal despite the growing knot in my stomach. When I returned from my sandwich and a walk around the block, Janet hadn't responded to my email. That wasn't unusual. She often got caught up in meetings and didn't check messages until late afternoon. But as the day wore on and 5 p.m. approached, I began to worry. At 5:47 p.m, my computer chimed with a new message. But it wasn't from Janet. It was an automated system notification. File access revoked. Classification updated to restricted. Contact administrator for additional information. When I tried to open the folder containing the documents, I got an error message. Access denied. Insufficient privileges. I sat there for a long moment staring at the screen. Then I packed up my things, said goodnight to the security guard, and drove home with one thought echoing in my head. What the hell had I just gotten myself into? That night, I barely slept. Every car that drove past my apartment seemed to slow down. Every creak of the building settling made me jump. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that I'd simply stumbled across some routine planning documents that were above my pay grade. But deep down, I knew I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see, and someone somewhere now knew that I'd seen it. I arrived at work the next morning 15 minutes early, hoping to catch Janet before the day got busy. Her office was dark, which wasn't unusual. She typically arrived around 9 a.m, preferring to avoid rush hour traffic. I settled into my cubicle and tried to focus on routine tasks while waiting for her response to my email. At 9:30, Janet still hadn't arrived. Her assistant, Maria, seemed unconcerned when I asked about her whereabouts. She had an early meeting downtown, Maria said, without looking up from her computer. Something about a new contract. She'll probably be in after lunch. But Janet never showed up that day, or the next. By Thursday, Maria was fielding calls from confused clients and increasingly worried family members. "Family emergency," she kept saying, but her voice lacked conviction. "She'll be back early next week." That's when I noticed my computer had been acting strangely. Programs were loading slower than usual, and several files I'd been working on had vanished from my desktop. When I tried to access my email archives, I discovered that my entire inbox from the previous week had been deleted, including my message to Janet. The IT department claimed it was a routine system update that had caused some data loss, but they couldn't explain why only certain files were affected, or why the deletions seemed to target specific date ranges. "These things happen," the technician said with a shrug. "That's why we tell everyone to back up important files." But I hadn't lost everything. Hidden in a rarely used folder buried deep in my directory structure, I found fragments of the documents I'd viewed. Not the complete files, but screenshots I'd taken without realizing it when my screen capture software had malfunctioned the day I first opened the folder. The images were partial and pixelated, but they showed enough to confirm that I hadn't imagined it all. Population consolidation zones, behavioural compliance credits, the 2030 target date. I was studying these fragments when my cubicle neighbour, Tom Rivera, leaned over the partition that separated our workstations. Tom was a junior analyst who'd started 6 months after me. We'd shared coffee breaks and complained about deadline pressures, but we weren't particularly close. "Hey," he whispered, glancing around nervously. "Can I ask you something weird?" I minimised my screen and nodded. "Did you happen to see anything strange in your files last week? Like documents that seemed out of place?" The question sent a chill through me. "What kind of document?" Tom looked around again, then rolled his chair closer. "I got this folder by mistake, I think. Had all these maps and charts about moving people around, controlling where they could live and work. Really creepy stuff." "What did you do with it?" "Forwarded it to my supervisor, just like protocol says. But then," he paused, lowering his voice even further. "Then my supervisor disappeared, just like Janet. And this morning, my computer was completely wiped. Like everything. They gave me some story about a virus, but I know that's not what happened." We stared at each other for a moment, both understanding that we'd stumbled into something much larger than either of us had realised. "Listen," Tom continued, "I printed out a few pages before I forwarded the files. You know, just in case my supervisor had questions about the content. I still have them at home. Tom, if what we saw is real, then we're probably in serious trouble just for talking about it." He glanced at the empty supervisor offices. "Look, I'm getting scared. First the files, then the disappearances, now the data wipes. Someone really doesn't want us to know what we saw. I made a decision that would haunt me for months. Meet me for coffee after work. The place on 5th Street, across from the library. We need to figure out what's going on." The rest of the day crawled by. I couldn't concentrate on my assigned tasks, constantly checking over my shoulder and jumping every time someone walked past my cubicle. At lunch, I took a walk to the local print shop and made copies of the screenshot fragments I'd found, storing the originals in a safety deposit box I'd opened on impulse. When 5 p.m. finally arrived, I packed up quickly and headed for the coffee shop. Tom was already there, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall. He looked like he hadn't slept much. "This is crazy," he said as I sat down. "I keep thinking we should just drop it, pretend we never saw anything. But we did see it, and people are disappearing." Tom nodded grimly and slid a manila folder across the table. "I printed these Tuesday night before everything went to hell." The folder contained 8 pages of documents similar to what I'd seen. Maps of major cities divided into coloured zones, a budget allocation chart for something called voluntary relocation assistance programs. Most disturbing was a page titled Resistance Mitigation Strategies that outlined plans for dealing with what it called non-compliant population segments. "Look at the dates," Tom said, pointing to timestamps in the corner of each page. "These were created last month, but they reference events scheduled for next year. It's like they're planning everything in advance." "Planning what exactly?" Tom pulled out his phone and opened a news app. "I've been researching all day. Look at this." He showed me article after article about new government initiatives, mandatory digital health passes, carbon credit systems tied to personal banking accounts, smart city infrastructure projects that included extensive surveillance networks. "Every single one of these programs is mentioned in the documents we saw," he said, "but in the news, they're presented as separate voluntary initiatives for public safety and environmental protection. Nobody's talking about how they all connect." I thought about the timeline I'd seen, the careful progression from voluntary compliance to mandatory enforcement. What if they're not separate initiatives? What if it's all part of a larger plan? Tom's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and went pale. "What is it?" "Text from an unknown number." He showed me the message. "Stop digging or join your supervisors." We sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then Tom stood up abruptly. "I'm done. This is too dangerous." "Tom, wait. No, I should never have gotten involved." "I'm going home, and tomorrow I'm requesting a transfer to a different department. I suggest you do the same." He left the folder on the table and walked out, leaving me alone with documents that could either be the ravings of a conspiracy theorist or evidence of the largest social engineering project in human history. I walked home through streets that suddenly seemed full of cameras and sensors, wondering if I was being watched, if every step was being recorded and analysed by systems I was only beginning to understand. When I got to my apartment, I found a note taped to my door. "Package delivered to management office." But I hadn't ordered anything, and when I checked with the building manager, there was no package waiting for me. The note was dated that morning, written in handwriting I didn't recognise. That night I made another impulsive decision. I drove to an internet cafe on the other side of town and used a public computer to create anonymous email accounts on several platforms. Then I uploaded the documents Tom had given me, along with my screenshot fragments, to multiple cloud storage services. If something happened to me, at least there would be a record. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already too late, that I'd been marked from the moment I opened that first folder. In my rearview mirror, I noticed the same dark sedan that had been behind me when I left the coffee shop. It followed me all the way home. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Every sound in the hallway outside my apartment sent me to the window, peering through blinds at empty streets that somehow felt full of hidden watchers. Tom didn't show up for work the next day, or the day after that. His desk was cleared out by the weekend, and when I asked Maria about it, she said he'd requested an immediate transfer to pursue other opportunities. But I knew better. Tom had been scared, and scared people in our situation didn't get transfers, they got disappeared. With Janet gone and Tom relocated to who knows where, I was left alone with fragments of documents that painted a picture too terrifying to ignore and too dangerous to pursue. But I had to know more. If this was real, if there truly was a coordinated plan to reshape society by 2030, then someone needed to document it. I began my research carefully, using the public library's computers and paying cash for internet access at various cafes around the city. I created a simple methodology, cross-referenced the terms and programs mentioned in the leaked documents with publicly available information, looking for patterns and connections that might confirm or refute what I'd seen. The results were more disturbing than I'd expected. Smart city gateways was mentioned in 17 different documents I'd glimpsed. A quick search revealed that Toronto had announced a partnership with a tech consortium to implement exactly such a system by 2026. The project would integrate biometric identification, real-time location tracking, and automated behavioural assessment into a single platform designed to optimise urban resource distribution. The public announcement described it as a voluntary program to help residents access services more efficiently. But buried in the technical specifications, I found references to compliance monitoring algorithms and automated privilege adjustment protocols. Amsterdam's digital citizenship pilot was even more explicit. Citizens who participated would receive carbon credits for demonstrating environmentally conscious behaviour, measured through smartphone tracking, purchase monitoring, and periodic check-ins at verification stations throughout the city. The credits could be used for transportation discounts, housing assistance, and priority access to healthcare. But what happened to citizens who didn't participate, or who failed to meet behavioural targets? The programme documentation was vague about consequences, mentioning only alternative pathways for non-participating residents. Singapore's implementation was the most advanced. Their sustainable living credit system had been operational for 8 months, and earlier reports claimed impressive results: 67% reduction in private vehicle usage, 45% decrease in meat consumption, and 89% compliance with residential energy limitations. I found a blog post from a Singapore resident that painted a different picture. The author, writing under an obvious pseudonym, described a society where every purchase, every journey, every social interaction was monitored and scored. Citizens who failed to maintain adequate sustainability ratings found themselves locked out of public transportation, unable to access certain stores, and restricted to specific residential areas. It started as incentives, the blogger wrote: green points for taking the bus, bonus credits for eating plant-based meals, rewards for staying in your assigned district. But the incentives became requirements so gradually that most people didn't notice the transition. Now, if your score drops too low, you simply can't function in society, and raising your score requires complete submission to the system's behavioural demands. The post had been published 3 weeks ago. When I tried to access it again the next day, the entire blog had been removed. I began compiling a spreadsheet of every program, initiative, and policy mentioned in the leaked documents, then researching whether similar real-world implementations existed. The results were consistent and terrifying. Every single item had a corresponding program either already active or scheduled for implementation within the next 2 years. Carbon credit systems tied to personal banking accounts, announced by the European Central Bank for rollout in 2026. Biometric checkpoints for access to essential services, pilot programs active in 12 major cities worldwide. Residential assignment based on compliance scores, being tested in 3 countries under the guise of efficient housing allocation. Digital identity requirements for all online activities, legislation pending in multiple jurisdictions to combat misinformation and ensure digital safety. The pattern was unmistakable. What appeared to be separate, well-intentioned programs were actually components of a comprehensive system designed to monitor, control, and modify human behaviour on a global scale, and they were all scheduled to reach full implementation by 2030. But the most chilling discovery came when I researched the organisational structure behind these initiatives. Many of the programs were funded through the same consortium of international organisations, tech companies, and government agencies. The same names appeared on advisory boards and implementation committees across different countries and continents. One name appeared particularly frequently: the Sustainable Future Institute, a think tank founded in 2019 with substantial backing from several major philanthropic foundations. Their published research covered everything from climate change mitigation to urban planning optimization. All of it sounded reasonable and beneficial, but when I dug deeper, I found connections to government contracts for surveillance technology, behavioural modification research, and something called population management systems architecture. The Institute's founder, a former UN administrator named Dr. Catherine Voss, had given speeches advocating for necessary sacrifices in individual autonomy to ensure species survival. In a 2023 interview, she'd said, "Democracy and freedom are luxuries we can no longer afford. The climate crisis requires coordinated action on a scale that voluntary compliance cannot achieve. We must be willing to accept temporary limitations on personal choice in service of permanent solutions to existential threats." Temporary limitations? I wondered if the people implementing these systems really believed they would be temporary, or if they knew exactly what they were building. A global cage disguised as environmental salvation. As weeks passed, my research expanded beyond simple correlation. I began mapping the financial relationships between organisations, tracking personnel movements between government agencies and private companies, documenting the timeline of policy implementations across different countries. What emerged was a picture of unprecedented coordination. The same small group of organisations was driving policy changes on every continent, using local governments as implementation vehicles for a globally designed system. But I was still missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. The documents Tom and I had seen referenced enforcement mechanisms that went beyond social credit scores and access restrictions. They mentioned relocation programs, resource rationing, and something ominously called population optimization protocols. I needed more information, but I was running out of safe ways to obtain it. My library research had attracted attention. I'd noticed the same security guard watching me during several visits, and the librarian had started asking unusual questions about my research topics. It was during one of these library sessions that everything changed. I was printing articles about digital identity legislation when someone approached my table. A woman in her 50s, professionally dressed, with a kind of composed demeanour that suggested either corporate management or government service. "Excuse me," she said quietly, "but I couldn't help noticing your research interests. Would you be interested in information that might fill in some gaps?" Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and leave, but she held up a folder that looked remarkably similar to the ones Tom and I had found. "My name is Elena Rodriguez," she said, sitting down without invitation. "Until 6 months ago, I was a sustainability coordinator for the United Nations Development Programme, and I think we need to talk." Eleanor insisted we meet somewhere more private. She suggested a small cafe in the Arts District, the kind of place that played acoustic music loud enough to mask conversation, and served coffee in mismatched cups to customers who minded their own business. I arrived first, choosing a table in the back corner where we could see both the entrance and the emergency exit. Eleanor appeared exactly on time, carrying a worn leather briefcase and wearing the expression of someone who'd made a decision that couldn't be undone. "Before we begin," she said, settling into the chair across from me, "I need you to understand something. What I'm about to share will put both of us in danger. Once you know this information, there's no going back to ignorance, no pretending you never heard it." I nodded, though part of me wanted to walk away. The smart thing would have been to thank her politely and leave, to find a new job in a different field and spend the rest of my life pretending I'd never seen those documents. But I stayed. Eleanor opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder. "You've been researching the sustainability initiatives, the smart city programs, the digital identity requirements. You're trying to understand how they all connect. How do you know what I've been researching?" "Because I helped design the connection points." She opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. "I spent 4 years working on what we called the Integrated Sustainability Platform. My job was to ensure that all the separate programs could interface with each other, share data, and coordinate responses. The documents she showed me were similar to what I'd seen before, but far more detailed. Organisational charts that mapped relationships between dozens of agencies and corporations, technical specifications for data sharing protocols, implementation timelines that showed how voluntary programs would transition to mandatory compliance. The public face of Agenda 2030 is real, Elena continued. The Sustainable Development Goals, the climate initiatives, the poverty reduction programs, all of that is genuine and necessary. But there's another layer, a coordinated system that uses these worthy goals as justification for unprecedented social control. She pointed to a document labelled Phase Architecture Overview. It showed 3 distinct implementation stages, exactly matching what I'd seen in the leaked files. Phase 1 focused on infrastructure development. Get people comfortable with digital systems. Establish the technical framework for monitoring and control. Most of this phase is already complete. Phase 2 was incentivisation. Make compliance attractive through benefits and rewards while gradually increasing the social and economic costs of non-participation. We're in the middle of this phase now. Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. Phase 3 is enforcement. By 2030, the system becomes mandatory. Citizens who don't comply lose access to banking, healthcare, housing assistance and employment. It's designed to make non-compliance practically impossible. I studied the documents, trying to process the implications, but surely people would resist. There would be protests, political opposition. That's been planned for 2. Eleanor flipped to a section titled Public Acceptance Strategies. It outlined a comprehensive approach to managing public opinion through media partnerships, social media manipulation, and strategic crisis deployment. Every potential objection has been anticipated and countered, she said. Privacy concerns are dismissed as selfish in the face of climate emergency. Economic fears are addressed through promises of universal basic income tied to compliance. Religious or cultural objections are characterised as dangerous extremism. She showed me polling data that tracked public acceptance of various control measures over time. The numbers were sobering. Support for digital identity requirements had grown from 23% to 67% in just 2 years, driven by concerns about online security and misinformation. Acceptance of carbon credit systems had increased even more dramatically after several high-profile climate disasters. People want to do the right thing, Elena said. They want to help save the planet and protect their communities. The system exploits that desire, channeling genuine concern into acceptance of comprehensive control. If this is all true, why did you leave? And why are you talking to me? Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. I left because I realised what we were really building. I told myself for years that we were creating tools to address genuine crises, that temporary restrictions on freedom were justified by the urgent need for coordinated action. But the restrictions were never meant to be temporary, were they? The people at the top, the ones making the real decisions, they genuinely believe that democracy and individual liberty are obstacles to human survival. They see free choice as a luxury we can't afford, personal autonomy as a threat to species-level coordination. She opened another section of the folder, revealing documents that made my stomach turn. Plans for optimal population distribution that involved moving millions of people from rural areas into monitored urban zones, resource allocation models that determined individual caloric allowances based on productivity scores, educational restructuring programs designed to align personal goals with collective necessities. This isn't just about environmental protection, Elena continued. It's about fundamentally restructuring human society. The climate crisis provided the justification, but the real goal is creating what they call sustainable civilization, a managed society where every aspect of human behaviour is optimised for collective outcomes. And everyone just goes along with it. Most people never see the whole picture. They only interact with their small piece of the system. Their local digital ID program, their neighbourhood carbon credit initiative, their workplace compliance monitoring. Each component seems reasonable in isolation. Elena showed me internal communications between program coordinators in different countries. The language was bureaucratic and sanitised, but the content was chilling. Updates on resistance containment strategies, reports on compliance acceleration techniques, and budget requests for population management infrastructure. The coordinators don't communicate directly about control or oppression, she explained. They use euphemisms like behavioural optimization and resource management efficiency. Most of them probably believe they're working on humanitarian projects, but you knew better. I figured it out gradually as I gained access to higher-level planning documents. By the time I understood what we were really building, I was already deeply involved. Leaving wasn't easy. They don't let people with my level of knowledge simply resign. She glanced around the cafe nervously. I've been in hiding for 6 months, moving between safe houses, trying to gather evidence that could expose the true scope of the program. Why haven't you gone to the media? Lena laughed bitterly. With what? Documents that can be dismissed as forgeries, claims that sound like conspiracy theories. The system is too large and too coordinated for traditional journalism to expose. By the time reporters could verify the connections and compile comprehensive evidence, the implementation would be complete. Then what's the solution? Documentation, preservation. We need to create a record that can't be suppressed or discredited. When people finally realise what's happened, they'll need proof that it was planned, that it wasn't just a series of unfortunate coincidences or well-intentioned policies gone wrong. Eleanor closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. That's why I approached you. Your research shows that you understand the connections, and you're not in a position where disappearing, you would draw unwanted attention. The casual way she mentioned my potential disappearance sent chills through me. What exactly are you asking me to do? Help me compile a comprehensive archive of evidence. Documents, communications, financial records, implementation timelines, everything we can gather to prove that this was a coordinated plan rather than organic policy development. And then what? Then we find a way to preserve that archive until people are ready to see the truth. Elena stood up, leaving the folder on the table. Think about it. But don't take too long. The implementation is accelerating and opportunities to document it are disappearing. She walked away, leaving me alone with documents that confirmed my worst fears about the scope and coordination of what I'd discovered. As I packed the folder into my bag, I noticed that my hands were shaking. Outside the cafe I looked for Elena, but she had already vanished into the crowd. I walked home through streets that seemed different now. Every camera and sensor a component of something larger and more threatening than I'd previously imagined. That night I read through Elena's documents 3 times, cross-referencing them with my own research. The evidence was overwhelming and terrifying, but it was also incomplete. We had proof of coordination and planning, but not enough to convince a sceptical public or overcome the sophisticated manipulation strategies the system employed. I made my decision while sitting in my apartment at 2 a.m, surrounded by papers that documented the systematic dismantling of human freedom in the name of planetary salvation. I was going to help Elena build her archive, whatever the cost, because if we didn't preserve the truth, there might not be anyone left who remembered what freedom had looked like. Eleanor and I established a communication protocol using encrypted messaging apps and anonymous email accounts. We met weekly at different locations, libraries, parks, shopping centres, never the same place twice. She provided documents and insider knowledge. I contributed research skills and a growing network of contacts who were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the sustainability programs. For 3 weeks, our collaboration produced results. We mapped the financial relationships between implementing organisations, documented the timeline of policy rollouts, and identified key personnel who moved between government agencies and private contractors. The archive grew to include hundreds of pages of evidence showing coordination that extended far beyond what any legitimate policy initiative would require. But our success made us careless. Eleanor was supposed to meet me at a downtown park on a Thursday evening. When she didn't show up after 30 minutes, I assumed she'd been delayed or forced to cancel for security reasons. But when I got home, I found an encrypted message waiting. They know, burning everything. Stay safe. That was the last communication I received from her. The next morning I tried calling the phone number she'd given me, but it went straight to a disconnected signal. Her backup email address returned an error message indicating the account had been terminated. It was as if Elena Rodriguez had never existed, but someone knew she had existed, and someone knew we'd been working together. I returned home from work that Friday to find my apartment door standing slightly ajar. Not wide open, just enough that I could tell it had been disturbed. The lock showed no signs of damage, which meant whoever had entered either had keys or possessed sophisticated lock-picking skills. Nothing obvious was missing. My television, computer equipment and jewellery were all exactly where I'd left them, but my laptop was gone, along with the portable drive where I'd been backing up our research. More disturbing, the folder Elena had given me was missing from the hiding place where I'd secured it. They'd taken only what they came for, leaving everything else untouched to maintain the illusion that nothing had happened. A professional job designed to look like nothing more than a minor break-in where the intruders had been scared away before taking anything valuable. But I knew better. I packed a bag with essentials and checked into a motel across town, paying cash and using a false name. From the safety of that anonymous room, I tried to assess the situation. Eleanor was gone, possibly dead. Our research had been compromised, and whoever was responsible for the break-in now knew that I'd seen evidence of their coordination. The smart thing to do would have been to run. Leave town, find a new job somewhere far away, and hope they'd consider me neutralised without taking more direct action. But I couldn't shake the feeling that running would only delay the inevitable. If Elena had been right about the scope and timeline of the implementation, then there would be nowhere to run. By 2030, the system would be global, and geographic escape would be impossible. The only real safety lay in exposure and resistance. But first, I needed to retrieve the backup files I'd hidden at the bank. I waited until Monday morning, then took a deliberately circuitous route to the safety deposit box location, watching for signs of surveillance. The street seemed normal, but I'd learned not to trust appearances. 3 different times I noticed the same dark sedan in my peripheral vision, always maintaining distance, never close enough to be obviously tailing me. The safety deposit box contained everything Elena and I had compiled, plus additional materials I'd gathered independently. Financial records, organisational charts, communications intercepts, and technical specifications for systems that hadn't been publicly announced. Enough evidence to prove coordination, but presented in a way that could easily be dismissed as coincidence by anyone not already convinced of the conspiracy. I was photocopying key documents when I noticed increased activity in the bank lobby. More security guards than usual, and customers who seemed more interested in watching the clientele than conducting banking business. The manager kept glancing in my direction with an expression that suggested he was expecting something to happen. I finished copying the most critical documents and returned the originals to the safety deposit box, but I could feel the walls closing in. As I walked toward the exit, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Exit through the rear service corridor. You have approximately 90 seconds. Elena. Somehow she was still alive and watching. I followed the instructions, slipping through a maintenance door that led to an alley behind the bank. A motorcycle was waiting, engine running, with a helmet hanging from the handlebars. No rider in sight, just another anonymous message taped to the fuel tank. Take Highway 9 north. Abandon bike at mile marker 47. Continue on foot. I'd never ridden a motorcycle before, but desperation made for a quick learning curve. The bike lurched and stalled twice before I managed to get it moving, but soon I was weaving through traffic toward the highway, my bag of copied documents secured under my jacket. In the rearview mirror I watched the dark sedan emerge from the bank parking lot, followed by 2 more vehicles that had materialised from side streets. They maintained professional distance, but their coordination was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. Highway 9 wound through rural farmland before entering forested hills. I pushed the motorcycle faster than was safe, taking curves at speeds that made the bike lean dangerously. But my pursuers had more powerful vehicles, and the gap between us was slowly closing. Mile marker 47 appeared just as the first sedan was close enough that I could see the driver's face in my mirror. I pulled off the road into a dense stand of trees, abandoned the bike as instructed, and plunged into the forest carrying my bag and hoping that Elena's plan included more than just continue on foot. The woods were thick enough to provide cover, but I could hear car doors slamming behind me and the voices coordinating a search. These weren't local police or federal agents conducting a routine investigation. The communication I overheard was too professional, too military in its efficiency. I'd been hiking for 20 minutes when I heard the helicopter. The aircraft appeared through the canopy overhead, flying in a search pattern with what looked like thermal imaging equipment. I pressed myself against the largest tree I could find and tried to remain motionless, but the helicopter circled back twice, its searchlight probing the forest floor. That's when I realised how far beyond normal law enforcement this had escalated. Whatever Eleanor and I had discovered, it was important enough to justify significant resources and risk considerable exposure. They weren't just trying to silence us. They were treating us as threats to something vital enough to deploy military-grade assets. The helicopter moved on, but I could hear searchers working their way through the trees, calling out grid coordinates and maintaining radio contact with their command structure. I needed to find better shelter, and I needed to get my evidence to someone who could use it. I was stumbling through undergrowth, trying to put distance between myself and the search teams, when I nearly walked into the woman standing behind a massive oak tree. Elena looked different. Thinner, older, with the kind of exhaustion that comes from months of running and hiding. But she was alive, and she gestured for silence while we listened to the search teams passing nearby. When the voices faded, she spoke in whispers. They raided my safe house 3 days ago, killed my contact and burned everything we hadn't already moved. She studied my face in the dim forest light. How much did you manage to save? I showed her the bag of documents. Copies of everything we compiled, plus some additional material I gathered independently. It's not enough, she said. Not nearly enough to convince anyone who isn't already looking for the truth. We need something undeniable, something that can't be dismissed or discredited. What do you have in mind? Elena pulled out a small device that looked like a modified smartphone. I still have access to some internal systems. My credentials haven't been revoked yet, probably because they don't want to create obvious evidence of a security breach, but it's only a matter of time. Access to what? Planning databases, communication archives, financial tracking systems. She activated the device, and its screen showed a complex interface with multiple security layers. If we can get to a hardwired connection point, I can download comprehensive proof of the coordination and planning. Where do we find a connection point? There's a data center about 15 miles from here. Meridian Consulting has server space there for their government contracts. If your employee credentials are still active, we might be able to get inside. The idea was insane. We were being hunted by people with helicopters and thermal imaging equipment, and Elena wanted to break into a secure facility to steal classified data. But looking at the determination in her eyes, I realized she was right. Half measures wouldn't be enough. We needed proof so comprehensive and undeniable that even the sophisticated manipulation strategies couldn't discredit it. How do we get there without being caught? Eleanor smiled grimly. Very carefully. We spent the next 6 hours moving through the forest, avoiding search teams and aircraft while Eleanor used her modified device to monitor pursuit communications. The searchers were thorough and well equipped, but they were operating under constraints that limited their effectiveness. Too much visible activity would draw unwanted attention from local authorities and media. By dawn, We'd reached the edge of the forest near a rural highway. Eleanor had been tracking traffic through surveillance networks, identifying patterns and gaps that would allow us to move without being detected. A delivery truck was scheduled to stop at a convenience store 2 miles from the data centre, providing cover for our final approach. Once we're inside the facility, we'll have maybe 30 minutes before someone notices the unauthorised access, Elena said, as we waited for the truck to arrive. I'll need that long to penetrate the security layers and download everything we can carry. And if we're caught? Then people who ask questions about sustainability programs will know what happened to us. The truck arrived on schedule, and we managed to slip into the cargo area during the driver's restroom break. 20 minutes later, we were hiding behind a dumpster outside the data centre, watching security guards patrol the perimeter. Eleanor studied the building through small binoculars. 3 guards, standard rotation every hour, camera coverage on all entrances, but there's a maintenance access point on the north side that's in a blind spot for about 40 seconds during shift changes. What about internal security? Biometric locks, access card readers, motion sensors. But your employee card should get us through the first 2 barriers, and I can handle the electronic systems once we're inside. We waited for the next guard rotation, then sprinted across an open parking area to the maintenance door. Eleanor connected her device to the lock mechanism while I watched for patrols. The lock clicked open just as footsteps echoed from around the corner. Inside, the data centre hummed with the sound of thousands of servers processing information for dozens of government agencies and private contractors. Elena led me through corridors lined with racks of equipment, navigating by memory and occasionally checking her device for layout updates. There, she whispered, pointing to a terminal station surrounded by screens displaying network activity. That's our access point. Eleanor's fingers flew across the keyboard, entering commands and passwords that bypassed security protocols I didn't understand. Screens filled with data streams, file directories, and communication logs that painted a picture of coordination so vast and detailed that even our previous research had barely scratched the surface. This is incredible, Elena breathed, watching terabytes of information flow past. Financial transactions between organisations on 6 continents. Personnel transfers coordinated across dozens of agencies. Technical specifications for systems that won't be announced for another year. She inserted a high-capacity storage device and began downloading everything she could access. File after file of evidence that proved beyond any doubt that the sustainability programs were components of a carefully orchestrated plan to restructure human society. But our time was running out. Alarms began sounding in distant parts of the building, and Elena's device showed security alerts cascading through the network. "They know we're here," she said, still typing furiously. "Another few minutes and I'll have everything." That's when the lights went out, and emergency lighting bathed the server room in the red illumination. Through the corridors I could hear doors slamming and radio chatter as security teams converged on our location. Eleanor yanked the storage device from the terminal. "That's all we're getting? Time to go." But as we turned toward the exit, figures in tactical gear emerged from both ends of the corridor, weapons drawn and voices shouting commands to surrender. We were trapped. The tactical team that surrounded us moved with military precision, but they weren't wearing any identifying insignia or badges. No agency names, no unit designations, just black uniforms and professional equipment operated by people who clearly weren't local law enforcement. "Device on the ground," the team leader commanded. "Hands visible." Eleanor hesitated, clutching the storage drive that contained terabytes of incriminating evidence. For a moment I thought she might try to destroy it rather than let them recover the data. But faced with multiple weapons, she complied, setting the device on the floor and raising her hands. "We're not terrorists," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're researchers investigating." Silence. The team leader approached Elena, studying her face with recognition. "Former Undersecretary Rodriguez. You've been difficult to locate." I imagine I have been. One of the tactical officers collected the storage device while others secured our hands with plastic restraints. They were efficient and professional, but there was something unsettling about their behaviour. No reading of rights, no identification of their authority, no explanation of charges or procedures. "What happens now?" I asked. The team leader ignored my question, speaking into a throat microphone in a language I didn't recognise. The response seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded to his team and gestured toward the exit. They marched us through the data centre to a loading dock where 2 black vehicles waited. As they prepared to separate us into different cars, Elena caught my eye and mouthed a single word. Remember. That was the last time I saw her. My captors drove for several hours through rural areas I didn't recognise, eventually arriving at what looked like a corporate retreat centre, surrounded by high fences and discreet security measures. They escorted me to a comfortable room that might have been a hotel suite if not for the reinforced door and lack of windows. For 3 days, no one spoke to me. Food appeared through a slot in the door and I was allowed supervised access to bathroom facilities, but my guards remained silent despite my attempts at conversation. I began to wonder if they were planning to hold me indefinitely, or if something worse was being prepared. On the 4th day, a woman in a business suit entered my room carrying a laptop computer and a stack of documents. "I'm Director Sarah Chen," she said, settling into the room's single chair. "I believe you have some questions about recent events." "Where's Elena?" "Former Undersecretary Rodriguez is being debriefed at another facility. Her cooperation will determine her future treatment." Director Chen opened her laptop and showed me surveillance footage of Elena and myself at various locations over the past weeks. The coverage was comprehensive, clearly demonstrating that our activities had been monitored far more closely than we'd realised. "We know about your collaboration, your research, and your infiltration of the data centre," she continued. "What we need to understand is the extent of your knowledge and the scope of your documentation. I want to speak with a lawyer. You're not under arrest, and this isn't a criminal proceeding. Consider this a national security consultation." Chen showed me financial records proving that Meridian Consulting received substantial funding from the same organisations Elena and I had been investigating. My own employer was part of the network we'd been trying to expose. "Your research was quite thorough," she admitted. "Impressively so, given your limited access to classified information. But you've misunderstood the nature and purpose of the coordination you discovered." "Have I?" "The programs you've documented represent humanity's best hope for addressing multiple existential crises simultaneously. Climate change, resource depletion, population pressures, technological disruption, all of these threaten our species' survival. Coordinated response isn't conspiracy, it's necessity." Chen pulled up charts and projections that painted a dire picture of humanity's future without intervention. Environmental collapse within decades, resource wars that would kill billions, social breakdown that would destroy civilization itself. "The coordination you've discovered exists because voluntary compliance with necessary changes has proven insufficient," she explained. "Democracy and individual choice are luxuries that become dangerous when the stakes involve species survival." "So you're admitting that the programs are designed to control people?" "I'm explaining that some degree of behavioural management is essential for ensuring that enough humans survive the coming crises to maintain technological civilization." Chen's tone was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing weather forecasts rather than the systematic elimination of human freedom. "And who decides what constitutes necessary control?" "People with access to comprehensive data and the responsibility for long-term outcomes. Scientists, policy analysts, systems engineers, experts who understand the complexity of the challenges we face." Chen showed me additional documents that detailed the decision-making processes behind the sustainability programs. Groups of highly credentialed professionals making choices based on computer models that calculated optimal outcomes for human survival and environmental stability. Every restriction, every monitoring system, every behavioural modification protocol has been designed to maximise the probability that technological civilization will persist through the crisis period, she said. "Personal freedom is irrelevant if there's no surviving society to exercise that freedom within." "But what if people don't want to be saved at the cost of their autonomy?" "Then they'll be saved anyway because the alternative is extinction." Chen closed her laptop and studied my face. "You have a choice, Marcus. You can accept that the coordination you've discovered serves a necessary purpose, or you can be classified as a threat to species survival. What does that classification entail?" "People who actively resist necessary survival measures cannot be allowed to interfere with implementation." Her voice remained calm and professional. Resistance will be contained through whatever means prove most effective. She stood up and walked toward the door. You have 24 hours to decide whether you want to be part of the solution or part of the problem. After Chen left, I sat alone in my comfortable prison, thinking about Eleanor's final word. Remember. Not resist, or fight, or escape, but remember. She wanted me to preserve what we'd learned, to document the truth regardless of what happened to us personally. That night, I used the room's basic amenities to create a primitive but functional recording device. If they planned to kill me or disappear me like so many others, I wanted to leave behind an account of what I'd discovered. But as morning approached, a different plan began to form. Chen had revealed more than she'd intended about the scope and coordination of the programs. If I could get that information to people who weren't part of the system, who might still be capable of resistance. The problem was finding a way to escape from a secure facility surrounded by professional guards and located in an unknown rural area. That's when I remembered the ventilation system I'd noticed during my supervised bathroom visits. The air circulation in the building was surprisingly robust, suggesting larger ducts than normal. If I could access the ductwork during the night shift when fewer guards were active. It was a desperate plan with minimal chance of success, but it was the only option I could identify. Eleanor and I had gathered enough evidence to prove the coordination and intent behind the sustainability programs. Now I needed to find a way to get that evidence to people who could act on it. Because if Chen was right about their timeline, there wasn't much time left. The countdown to 2030 was accelerating, and voluntary compliance was about to become mandatory enforcement. If someone didn't expose the truth soon, there might not be anyone left who remembered what freedom had felt like. That night I began my escape attempt, knowing that failure would likely mean death, but also knowing that staying silent would mean something even worse. The permanent victory of a system that viewed human autonomy as an obstacle to be eliminated. As I crawled through the ventilation system toward an uncertain freedom, Eleanor's voice echoed in my memory. Remember? I would remember, and if I survived, I would make sure others remembered too. The ventilation system led me through the building's interior to a roof access point that emerged behind a cluster of communication equipment. From there, I could see the facility's perimeter, motion sensors, thermal cameras, and patrol routes that created overlapping coverage zones. But I could also see something the guards probably hadn't noticed. A service road that wound through the forest to a highway maintenance station about 2 miles away. Getting off the roof and across the monitored perimeter required timing and luck. I waited until the patrol cycles created a 40-second gap in coverage near the eastern fence, then dropped to the ground and sprinted toward the tree line. Motion sensors tracked my movement, but by the time the response team reached my position, I was already deep enough in the forest to avoid their thermal imaging. The service road was overgrown and clearly abandoned, but it provided a path through the woods that avoided the main security sensors. I followed it through the night, expecting pursuit teams to emerge from the darkness at any moment. But either my escape hadn't been discovered yet, or they were confident enough in their perimeter security to assume I couldn't have gotten far. The highway maintenance station was a collection of rusted equipment and storage sheds that hadn't been used in years. But it had what I needed, a working telephone line connected to the state highway system. Using calling cards I'd purchased weeks earlier, I began making contact with a network of researchers and journalists who'd been asking questions about the sustainability programs. The first 3 people I called had disconnected numbers. The 4th was answered by someone who claimed never to have heard of the person I was trying to reach. But the 5th call connected me with Alex Morrison, an investigative journalist who'd been documenting inconsistencies in climate policy implementation. "I know who you are," Alex said after I identified myself. "Elena Rodriguez contacted me before she disappeared. She said you might call if something happened to her. She's alive, but being held by people who don't officially exist. Can you prove what you're claiming?" "I have documents, communications, financial records, and organisational charts that prove coordination between agencies and corporations on 6 continents. Everything we need to demonstrate that the sustainability programs are components of a larger control system." Alex was quiet for a moment. "Where are the documents?" "Hidden in multiple locations. But first I need guarantees about how this information will be used. If you publish it the wrong way, they'll discredit it as conspiracy theorizing and use the attention to accelerate their timeline. What do you suggest? Simultaneous release across multiple platforms, with technical verification of the document authenticity and financial confirmation of the relationships we've mapped, make it impossible to dismiss as fabricated evidence. Alex agreed to coordinate with contacts at other publications and technical organisations. We established a timeline for document delivery and verification, with publication scheduled for exactly 72 hours later. Enough time to properly authenticate the evidence, but not enough for the coordinating organisations to mount an effective suppression campaign. But first I had to retrieve the evidence from its hiding places without being captured. Over the next 2 days, I moved carefully between the locations where Elena and I had cached our research. Bank safety deposit boxes, storage lockers, and dead drops we'd established in case our primary archives were compromised. Each retrieval required elaborate security measures to avoid the surveillance networks that were undoubtedly looking for me. The most dangerous recovery was the data storage device Elena had hidden at a commercial facility across town from where she'd been captured. Getting to it required passing through areas that were certainly being monitored, using public transportation that would create records of my movement. I solved the surveillance problem by adopting the appearance and behaviour of the city's homeless population. Dirty clothes, unkempt appearance, and the kind of invisible desperation that made most people look away rather than remember faces. The disguise was psychologically difficult but operationally effective. Security cameras recorded me, but human attention filtered me out as irrelevant. The storage facility contained Elena's most sensitive archives, communication intercepts between coordination directors, financial tracking systems that showed money moving between organisations, and technical specifications for monitoring systems that hadn't been publicly announced. But it also contained something I hadn't expected, a video file labelled Emergency Broadcast Final Testimony. Eleanor had recorded the video shortly before her capture, speaking directly to the camera with the kind of urgency that suggested she knew she was running out of time. If you're watching this, then the coordination has been exposed and I'm either dead or disappeared, she began. What Marcus and I discovered represents the largest social engineering project in human history. Not a conspiracy by evil people, but a coordinated effort by people who genuinely believe that human freedom is incompatible with species survival. The video detailed information that Elena hadn't shared during our collaboration. Names of key coordinators, locations of planning facilities, and timelines for implementation phases that extended beyond 2030. The 2030 target date is just the beginning, she explained. Phase 3 establishes the control infrastructure, but Phase 4 involves what they call optimization protocols, systematic reduction of global population to what computer models indicate is the maximum sustainable level for technological civilization. Elena's final message was addressed to whoever would eventually broadcast the evidence. This isn't about politics or ideology. It's about whether human beings will be allowed to make their own choices about their lives, their communities, and their future. The people implementing these programs believe that freedom is a luxury we can't afford. They may be right about the severity of the crises we face, but they're wrong about the solution. I copied Elena's video along with the other archived materials, then destroyed the original storage system to prevent recovery by pursuit teams. By the time I reached the final rendezvous point, I was carrying comprehensive proof of coordination that spanned multiple continents and involved hundreds of organisations. Alex Morrison had assembled a coalition of journalists, researchers and technical experts who would simultaneously verify and publish the evidence. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, overwhelming the suppression capabilities of even the most sophisticated coordination networks by releasing information through so many channels that controlling the narrative would be impossible. On the appointed day, I delivered the complete archive to Alex's team and waited for the storm to break. The initial coverage was everything we'd hoped for. Detailed analysis of the financial relationships, technical verification of document authenticity, and expert commentary that confirmed the feasibility of the coordination we'd documented. For 48 hours it seemed like we'd succeeded in exposing the truth. But then the counter-narrative began. The same news outlets that had initially covered the story began running follow-up pieces questioning the interpretation of the evidence. Expert sources appeared who offered alternative explanations for the coordination patterns, legitimate policy cooperation, standard bureaucratic relationships, normal business arrangements between contractors and agencies. The documents were real, these experts acknowledged, but they represented routine governmental and corporate activities rather than evidence of conspiracy. Climate policy required coordination, they explained. International cooperation was essential for addressing global challenges. The patterns we'd identified were exactly what effective governance should look like. Social media platforms began flagging our evidence as disputed information and potentially misleading content. Search algorithms modified to reduce the visibility of articles about the coordination. Discussion forums where people shared our documents were closed for policy violations. Within a week, public attention had moved on to other stories. The comprehensive evidence that Elena and I had risked our lives to gather was dismissed by mainstream discourse as another conspiracy theory promoted by people who didn't understand the complexity of modern governance. But we had succeeded in one crucial way. We'd created a permanent record that couldn't be completely suppressed. People who were looking for the truth could find it, could study the evidence, could draw their own conclusions about what it meant. And as the months passed, some of those people began to notice patterns that confirmed our warnings. 6 months later, I'm writing this from a cabin in rural Montana, living off-grid with cash transactions and avoiding any technology that could be used to track my location. The official story is that I suffered a mental breakdown and disappeared, leaving behind rambling conspiracy theories that no serious person would take seriously. Elena was released after 3 weeks of debriefing, but she's not the same person who risked everything to expose the truth. When she appears in public now, she speaks about the importance of international cooperation and the necessity of accepting temporary restrictions on personal freedom to address climate change. Her eyes have a vacant quality that suggests pharmaceutical management of her personality. Our evidence is still available to anyone persistent enough to look for it, but it's been successfully marginalised through the same techniques we documented: expert counter-narrative, algorithmic suppression, and social media manipulation. The truth exists, but it's been rendered effectively invisible to most people, and the implementation continues. Over the past 6 months, the changes have accelerated in ways that make our warnings seem prophetic. Major banks announce mandatory digital identity verification for all accounts, citing the need to prevent fraud and ensure regulatory compliance. Anyone without approved digital credentials finds themselves unable to access their money. Social media platforms implemented verified citizen requirements for posting or commenting, claiming the need to combat misinformation and protect democratic institutions. Anonymous speech has been effectively eliminated from digital communication. Streaming services, e-commerce sites, and online service providers rolled out verified citizen login systems that require government identification to access content. Entertainment and shopping have become privileges granted to compliant citizens. The carbon credit systems we documented are now operational in major cities, with personal behaviour tracked through smartphone monitoring, purchase surveillance, and periodic compliance verification. Citizens who fail to meet sustainability targets find themselves restricted from certain activities and locations. Employment in most major corporations now requires participation in behavioural modification programs that monitor everything from dietary choices to social media activity. Non-compliance results in professional exclusion that makes economic survival difficult. The changes happen gradually enough that each new restriction seems reasonable in isolation, justified by immediate crises, and presented as temporary measures that will be relaxed once stability is achieved. But people with longer memories can see the pattern. Each temporary restriction becomes permanent infrastructure for the next phase of control. I'm sitting in a library in a small town where they haven't yet installed biometric scanners for internet access. The computer I'm using doesn't require government identification, though I know that's changing. Signs posted throughout the building announce that new security measures will be implemented next month to ensure patron safety and prevent unauthorized access. On the news website, a UN representative is speaking about the success of digital identity programs in reducing fraud and improving service delivery. She announces that by 2030, all essential services will be tied to universal digital identification to ensure equitable access and protect vulnerable populations. As she speaks, the library computer screen freezes. A message appears: session terminated. Credentials required. I look around the library and notice that half the computers now display the same message. A technician is installing new card readers at each terminal, requiring government identification to access the internet. Outside the library windows, construction workers are installing biometric scanners at the entrance to the grocery store across the street. A small crowd has gathered to watch, some curious, others concerned. But no one is protesting. The changes are presented as upgrades to improve efficiency and security. I pack up my things and walk toward the exit, passing the information desk where librarians are helping patrons register for the new identification requirements. Their voices are cheerful and helpful as they explain how the new system will make library services more convenient and secure. The countdown Elena and I discovered isn't to some distant dystopian future. It's to the completion of a transformation that's already underway, implemented gradually enough that most people don't recognise the scope of what's changing. As I walk past the grocery store with its new biometric scanners, I whisper into the voice recorder I've been using to document these final observations. We're not waiting for 2030 anymore, it's already here. The recording device clicks off, and I realise this might be the last time I'm able to document the truth without sophisticated countermeasures to detect and suppress it. Soon, even whispered testimony in small-town libraries will be monitored and analysed by systems designed to prevent the spread of dangerous ideas. Elena was right about one thing. The people implementing these systems genuinely believe they're saving humanity from itself. They may even be correct about the severity of the crises we face, but they're fundamentally wrong about the solution. Freedom isn't a luxury that humanity can't afford. It's the foundation that makes everything else worth preserving. Without the right to make our own choices, to speak our own thoughts, and to determine our own futures, survival becomes indistinguishable from sophisticated imprisonment. The evidence Elena and I gathered will survive in hidden archives and encrypted networks, waiting for a generation that might remember what freedom felt like. Maybe someday, people will rediscover the courage to choose uncertainty over security, autonomy over optimization, and human dignity over species management. But that day feels very far away as I watch the scanners being installed and the last anonymous spaces disappearing into a world where every action, every movement, every thought is monitored, recorded, and evaluated by systems that know what's best for us better than we do ourselves. The 2030 directive isn't coming. It's here. What if the most powerful secret society in the world wasn't hiding their evil plans, but keeping something far worse from awakening? Tonight's chilling tale takes us deep into the redwood forests of California, where ancient rituals and modern power collide in ways you never imagined. Special thanks to Langalman for suggesting this spine-tingling concept. If you have ideas for future stories, drop them in the comments below. And if you're enjoying these midnight journeys into the unknown, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more tales that blur the line between conspiracy and nightmare. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped between my electric bill and a stack of rejection letters from publishers who wouldn't touch my work anymore. Plain white paper, no return address, postmarked from San Francisco but feeling like it had travelled much farther than the 300 miles from the city. My name was written in careful block letters across the front. ALEXMORGAN. Nothing else. No apartment number, though whoever sent it knew exactly where to find me in this cramped studio above the Chinese restaurant on Divisadero Street. I'd been blacklisted for 18 months now, ever since I published that expose on Meridian Industries and their illegal arms deals with 3 different terror groups. The story won awards, toppled a senator, and destroyed my career in equal measure. Turns out some truths are too expensive for the media to handle. The lawsuit bankrupted the magazine, my editor disappeared into witness protection, and I became radioactive to every publication from the Chronicle to Mother Jones. But someone still thought I was worth reaching. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of cream-coloured paper, expensive stock, with an embossed header that made my hands shake. The Bohemian Club, San Francisco. Below that, an invitation written in the same careful script. Mr. Alex Morgan is cordially invited to attend the summer encampment at Bohemian Grove, Monterey, California, July 15th to 31st, 2024. Guest privileges have been arranged. Transportation and accommodation provided. This invitation is non-transferable and expires at sundown on July 15th. At the bottom, written in different handwriting, rushed, urgent, was a single line that would haunt me for weeks. This is your last chance to see the truth. Don't waste it. Bohemian Grove. I'd heard whispers, read the conspiracy theories, seen the grainy photos leaked over the years. Every July, the most powerful men in America, presidents, CEOs, generals, media moguls, retreated to 2,700 acres of ancient redwoods north of San Francisco for 2 weeks of what they called fellowship, what the rest of the world called the most secretive gathering of the American elite. No journalists allowed, no cameras, no women, no record of what happened behind those gates, except for the occasional leaked photo of men in robes standing before a massive owl statue, performing something called the cremation of care ceremony. Political theatre most assumed. Rich men playing dress-up while they planned the next war or market crash. But this invitation was real. The paper felt authentic. The letterhead matched samples I'd seen in archived documents. Someone with serious connections wanted me inside those gates. The question was why. I spent 3 days researching everything I could find about the Grove. The official history spoke of artistic pursuits, informal talks, and male bonding among the country's leadership. The unofficial history painted darker pictures: secret deals, occult rituals, decisions that shaped global politics made during drunken conversations around campfires. The most disturbing accounts came from the few infiltrators who'd made it inside over the decades. They described the opening ceremony where members dressed as druids and burned an effigy called Care before a giant concrete owl. They spoke of lakeside talks where defense contractors pitched new weapons to Pentagon officials, of quiet conversations that preceded major policy announcements, of a casual corruption so normalized it felt like summer camp for sociopaths. But none of them had stayed long. Most were caught and expelled within days. The security was too tight, the members too paranoid, the stakes too high for any real investigation. Whoever sent this invitation was giving me something no journalist had ever possessed: legitimate access. The question was whether I was walking into the story of a lifetime or a trap that would finish what Meridian Industries had started. On the morning of July 14th, I made my decision. I packed light, a small camera hidden in my toiletry kit, a digital recorder disguised as an inhaler, a notebook I could claim was for poetry if questioned, everything that might help me document what happened behind those gates. The invitation included a phone number. When I called, a woman's voice gave me an address in Santa Rosa and told me to be there by 6 p.m. sharp. No other details. No explanation of who had arranged this or what they expected in return. I drove north through wine country as the sun set, watching the hills turn gold and purple in the fading light. The address led to a small parking lot behind a defunct gas station. 3 black SUVs waited, engines running, windows tinted. A man in a plain suit approached my car before I'd even turned off the engine. "Morgan?" he asked. I nodded. "Leave your keys in the ignition. Someone will return your car when you're finished." "Finished with what?" He didn't answer, just opened the passenger door of the middle SUV and waited. I grabbed my bag and climbed in, noting the soundproof partition between front and back seats, the lack of door handles on the interior. Whatever was happening, there would be no turning back once we started moving. The drive took 40 minutes through increasingly dense forest. No conversation, no music, just the hum of tyres on asphalt and the gradual realisation that I was committing to something I didn't understand. My phone lost signal after the first 10 minutes. The windows were too dark to see landmarks. By the time we stopped, I had no idea where we were or how to get back. The gates of Bohemian Grove appeared suddenly in our headlights. Massive wooden barriers flanked by stone pillars, with the carved image of an owl watching from above. Guards emerged from hidden positions, checked documents, waved us through. The SUV followed a winding road deeper into the forest, past smaller camps with names like Hillbillies and Lost Angels painted on rustic signs. We stopped at a cluster of simple cabins near what appeared to be a lake. The man in the suit handed me a small leather folder. "Your documentation," he said. "You're a guest of the Mandalay camp. Keep your head down, your mouth shut, and your eyes open. Someone will contact you when it's time." Time for what? But he was already walking back to the SUV. I watched the taillights disappear into the trees, leaving me alone in the most secretive place in America with nothing but a fake identity, and questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Inside the leather folder was a camp roster listing me as a Morgan, Investment Banking, Chicago. Below that was a simple map of the Grove and a schedule of events. Tomorrow night was marked in red. Cremation of Care Ceremony, 9:30 p.m, Sacred Grove. At the bottom of the page, in the same urgent handwriting from the invitation, was one final note. "Watch for the second ceremony. That's where the real truth begins." The morning brought sounds I'd never expected to hear in such a place. Laughter, casual conversation, the clink of coffee cups on saucers. Looking out the window of my assigned cabin, I saw men who controlled trillions of dollars and millions of lives shuffling around in bathrobes and flip-flops like they were at a summer camp. Because that's exactly what it was, I realised. The most exclusive, powerful summer camp in the world. I dressed in the khakis and polo shirt that had been left in my closet, the Grove's unofficial uniform, and stepped outside to explore. The camp sprawled across the forest in a seemingly random pattern of paths and clearings, each dedicated to different groups with names that sounded like fraternity houses. Caveman, Silverado, Owl's Nest, Sons of Toil. At the central plaza I found what looked like a small town square, a dining hall large enough for hundreds, a stage for performances, a bar that was already serving despite the early hour. Men moved between these spaces with the easy familiarity of those who'd done this many times before. Some faces I recognised from television and magazine covers. Senators CEOS, a former Secretary of State. Others were anonymous but carried themselves with the quiet confidence that comes from wielding serious power. The strangest part was how normal it all felt. These were the people conspiracy theorists claimed ran secret cabals to control world events, and they were arguing about baseball scores and complaining about their golf games like any group of aging fraternity brothers. First time at the Grove? I turned to find a heavy-set man in his 60s, silver hair perfectly styled despite the casual setting. His face was familiar, but I couldn't place it immediately. "That obvious?" I asked. He laughed. "You've got that wide-eyed look. Everyone does their first time. I'm Bill. Been coming here for 23 years. Alex, investment banking. Right. Mandalay camp. Heard you were joining us. What brings you to our little retreat?" It was a casual question, but something in his tone suggested it wasn't casual at all. I'd prepared for this. "Market analysis consultant," I said. "Specialised in political risk assessment. Figured this might be a good place to network." Bill nodded slowly. "Indeed it is. You'll want to catch tonight's ceremony if you haven't seen it before. Quite a spectacle. Been the same for nearly a century now. The owl thing, cremation of care. Beautiful tradition. Helps everyone leave their worries behind, focus on fellowship." He paused, studying my face. "Though I suspect you might find other aspects of our gathering more professionally relevant." Before I could ask what he meant, Bill was walking away, leaving me with the distinct impression that I'd just passed some kind of test. I spent the day observing, noting the casual interactions between men whose public relationships were supposedly adversarial. A Democratic senator sharing drinks with a Republican defense contractor, a tech CEO deep in conversation with someone I was pretty sure ran the NSA, a former president holding court near the lake, surrounded by media executives who hung on his every word. This was where real policy got made, I realised. Not in committee meetings or official negotiations, but in these informal moments between men who'd known each other for decades. The Grove was a lubricant for American power, a place where opposing sides could find common ground away from cameras and constituents. As afternoon turned to evening, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations became more hushed, more urgent. Staff members appeared with cases of equipment I couldn't identify. The lake area was cordoned off with rope barriers. Whatever was happening tonight, it was bigger than casual networking. At sunset, I joined the stream of men walking toward the sacred grove, a natural amphitheatre carved into the hillside dominated by the famous owl statue. 40 feet tall, carved from concrete, with burning eyes that watched over everything. Hundreds of folding chairs faced a small stage where men in hooded robes were preparing props I couldn't make out in the growing darkness. The ceremony began with music. A choir hidden in the trees, singing something that sounded like a funeral dirge. Then came the procession. 24 men in flowing robes, carrying torches, escorting what appeared to be a small coffin draped in black cloth. A voice boomed from speakers hidden throughout the forest, narrating the death of Care and its cremation before the great owl. The robed figures placed the coffin on a pyre and set it ablaze while the choir reached a crescendo. Flames leaped toward the owl's glowing eyes as hundreds of the world's most powerful men watched in reverent silence. It should have been absurd. Grown men playing dress-up, performing amateur theatre in the woods. Instead, it felt genuinely eerie. Something about the ancient trees, the flickering shadows, the synchronized movement of so many people participating in a ritual most of them probably didn't fully understand. Then the lights went out. Not just the ceremonial flames, everything. The owl's eyes went dark, the hidden speakers went silent, even the subtle path lighting I'd barely noticed disappeared. We were plunged into absolute darkness. Hundreds of men sitting in chairs carved into a hillside with no way to see where they were going. But instead of panic or confusion, there was silence. Complete unnatural silence. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. It was as if the entire gathering had been frozen in place. I waited for someone to call for help, for flashlights to appear, for the normal response to a power outage. Instead, I heard something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Footsteps. Measured, deliberate, moving through the crowd with impossible precision despite the darkness. The footsteps stopped near the front of the amphitheatre. Then came a voice, speaking in what sounded like Latin, words I couldn't understand but that seemed to resonate in my chest. Other voices joined in, creating a chant that built and built until it felt like the forest itself was vibrating with sound. This wasn't part of the official ceremony, this was something else entirely. The chanting stopped as abruptly as it had begun. A few seconds later the lights returned. Owl's eyes blazing, speakers crackling back to life, the master of ceremonies continuing his narration as if nothing had happened. The spell was broken, men began talking and moving again. The formal ceremony concluded with applause and casual conversation. But as we filed out of the sacred grove, I noticed something that chilled me. At least 24 men weren't heading back to the camps with everyone else. Instead, they were walking deeper into the forest, following a path I hadn't noticed before. All of them carried small flashlights, and all of them moved with the purposeful direction of people who knew exactly where they were going. I hung back, letting the main crowd pass, then followed the breakaway group at a distance. They were easy to track. The flashlight beams bobbed through the trees like fireflies, leading toward a part of the grove I hadn't seen on any map. The path wound uphill for nearly half a mile before opening into a smaller clearing I would never have found on my own. Here, hidden from the main camp by dense forest, was a second amphitheatre. Older, more primitive, carved from natural rock formations rather than built from concrete and steel. At the centre stood not an owl but a stone altar, covered with symbols I didn't recognise. The 24 men formed a circle around it, no longer in ceremonial robes but in simple black clothing. They were chanting again, but this time I could make out some of the words. English mixed with Latin, speaking of binding and containment, of keeping something sleeping, of maintaining the barriers that held back chaos. As they chanted, one man stepped forward with something I definitely hadn't expected to see. A wooden crate, old and weathered, marked with symbols and what appeared to be a date from the 1940s. This was the real ceremony. Everything at the sacred grove had been theatre for the masses. This was why I'd been invited, why someone wanted a journalist to witness what happened in the shadows of America's most secretive gathering. I pressed closer, trying to see what was in the crate, but the trees blocked my view. All I could make out were the chanted words, growing more urgent now, in the sense that something ancient and dangerous was being carefully, deliberately contained. Then one of the men looked directly at me. The man who spotted me was younger than the others, maybe 45, with the lean build of someone who stayed in shape despite spending his days behind a desk. In the flickering torchlight, I couldn't make out his face clearly, but his posture suggested military training. He raised a hand and the chanting stopped instantly. "We have a visitor," he said, voice carrying easily across the clearing. I considered running, but there was nowhere to go. The path back was too narrow, too winding, and I'd never find my way in the dark. Instead, I stepped forward into the light, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "Alex Morgan," I said. "Mandalay Camp, I was just—" "You were just following us," the man interrupted. "Question is why?" An older man emerged from the circle, someone I now recognised as a former defence secretary, whose tenure had spanned 3 administrations. His presence here transformed this from concerning to terrifying. These weren't just wealthy eccentrics playing games. These were people who controlled military budgets and intelligence operations. "Show him," the defence secretary said simply. 2 men stepped aside, giving me a clear view of the stone altar. The surface was covered with carved symbols that looked far older than anything else in the grove, spirals and geometric patterns that seemed to shift in the torchlight. The wooden crate sat at the centre, its lid partially open to reveal something that gleamed metallic in the flickering light. "Do you know what you're looking at, Mr. Morgan?" the defence secretary asked. I shook my head, not trusting my voice. "Project Owl," he continued, "started in 1943, continued in various forms ever since. The Grove isn't just a social club, it's a containment facility." "Containment for what?" The younger man laughed, but there was no humour in it. "You wouldn't believe us if we told you. Hell, most of the members don't know. They think they're here for networking and male bonding. The cremation of care is just pageantry to them, a quaint tradition with symbolic meaning. But the real ceremony," I gestured toward the altar, "is about keeping something very old, very powerful and very dangerous from waking up," the defence secretary finished. "The owl isn't a symbol we worship, Mr. Morgan. It's a prison we maintain." They were all watching me now, measuring my reaction, waiting to see how I'd process what they were telling me. Part of me wanted to laugh. This sounded like the fever dreams of conspiracy theorists, ancient evils and shadow governments and occult containment protocols. But the setting was too real, the participants too credible, the ritual I'd witnessed too elaborate to be fiction. "What's in the crate?" I asked. "The original binding artifacts," said a woman's voice from behind me. I spun around to find someone who definitely hadn't been there moments before. A woman in her 70s, silver hair pulled back severely, wearing clothes that managed to look both practical and expensive. Her presence violated everything I knew about the Grove's men-only policy. "Eleanor Hartwell," she said, extending a hand. "I've been managing Project Owl since 1987. Women aren't allowed. In the social aspects, no. But some secrets are too important for gender politics." She moved past me to examine the crate's contents. These were recovered from a Nazi expedition to Tibet in 1943. The SS Ahnenerbe thought they'd found artifacts that could summon and control ancient powers. They were half right. She lifted something from the crate, a metal disc covered with the same spiralling symbols as the altar, but these seemed to move on their own, shifting and changing as I watched. "The Tibetan monks who originally possessed these weren't trying to summon anything," Eleanor continued. "They were trying to keep something asleep. When Hitler's occultists broke the original binding, they didn't gain power. They released something that had been contained for centuries." "What kind of something?" the defence secretary answered. "Call it what you like. Ancient god, interdimensional entity, primordial force of chaos. The names don't matter. What matters is what it does when it's free." He gestured, and one of the other men brought out a tablet computer incongruous in this setting of torches and stone altars. The screen showed a map of the world with red markers scattered across it. "Every time the binding weakens, we see spikes in seemingly random catastrophic events," he explained. "Political assassinations, market crashes, natural disasters, terrorist attacks. Not caused directly, but influenced. Chaos spreads like a virus when certain barriers are down. The grove was established here because of the natural properties of these particular redwoods, Eleanor added. Old growth forests have natural resonance with certain types of, let's call them spiritual phenomena. The founding members didn't understand the science, but they recognised the effect. The annual gathering, the rituals, the focused attention of powerful minds, it all serves to reinforce the containment. And the cremation of care is a distraction, the younger man said. Theatre for the masses while we handle the real work. Most of the members genuinely believe they're here for fellowship and networking. The inner circle knows better. I looked around the group, trying to count how many people were part of this inner circle. Maybe 30 total, out of the thousands who'd attended grove encampments over the decades. A shadow organisation within a secret society, managing what they claimed was an existential threat to human civilization. Why tell me this? I asked. Why invite a journalist? Eleanor and the Defence Secretary exchanged glances. Something passed between them, a decision being made in real time. Because we're dying off, Eleanor said finally. The knowledge, the responsibility, the burden, it's all been passed down through personal relationships for 80 years. But the world has changed. The people with the power and resources to maintain the containment aren't necessarily the people we can trust with the truth. New money doesn't understand old responsibilities, the Defence Secretary added. Tech billionaires, crypto moguls, social media executives, they have the influence we need, but they think everything can be solved with apps and algorithms. They don't believe in things that can't be quantified. So you need documentation, I realised. A record of what really happens here. Insurance in case the oral tradition breaks down. Exactly, Eleanor confirmed. But it has to be someone outside the power structure. Someone with credibility and investigative skills. Someone who's already proven they'll publish dangerous truths regardless of personal cost. She meant my Meridian Industries expose. This was why I'd been blacklisted and then mysteriously invited. They needed a journalist who demonstrated willingness to sacrifice their career for a story. What happens if the binding fails completely? I asked. The group fell silent. Finally, the younger man spoke. Look at any period of sustained global chaos in human history. The fall of Rome, the Black Death, the World Wars, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Times when multiple systems failed simultaneously, when cause and effect stopped making sense, when it felt like the world was coming apart at the seams. Those were natural historical processes. Were they? Eleanor interrupted. Or were they what happens when humanity loses the ability to maintain certain spiritual defences? The monks who originally bound this thing warned that it feeds on conflict and confusion. The more chaos it causes, the stronger it becomes, until the binding fails entirely. She returned the metal disc to the crate and closed the lid carefully. The ceremony you just witnessed reinforces the containment for another year, she said, but each time it gets harder. The original artifacts are degrading, the knowledge is fragmenting, and the world is changing in ways that make traditional approaches less effective. How long do we have? Unknown, the Defence Secretary admitted. Could be decades, could be years, could be tomorrow if something goes wrong. That's why we need someone on the outside, someone who can document not just what we do, but why we do it. Insurance for the future. As if summoned by his words, a low rumble echoed through the forest. Not thunder, the sky was clear. Something deeper, more primal, like the earth itself was groaning. The torches flickered, and for a moment the carved symbols on the altar seemed to glow with their own light. Then everything went still again. Time to go, Eleanor said quietly. The ceremony's complete, but the effects can be unpredictable for the first few hours. The group began dispersing, each member taking a different path back through the forest. Within minutes, I was alone with Eleanor and the Defence Secretary, the altar dark and silent again. There's more to see, Eleanor told me, but not tonight. Tomorrow, if you're serious about this responsibility, we'll show you the archives, the complete record of Project Owl going back to its inception. And if I'm not serious? Then you'll have an interesting story about rich men playing games in the woods, the Defence Secretary said, which is what 90% of the attendees would tell you anyway. They walked away in different directions, leaving me standing alone beside the stone altar. The forest felt different now. Not threatening exactly, but aware, as if something vast and patient was watching from between the trees, held in check by forces I was only beginning to understand. I found my way back to Mandalay Camp by following the distant sound of laughter from the main plaza. Men were still awake, drinking and talking around campfires, processing the evening's official ceremony. To them, it had been a meaningful but ultimately symbolic ritual. They had no idea what had happened in the hidden clearing, no sense that their casual gathering served a purpose beyond networking and tradition. Back in my cabin, I sat on the narrow bed and tried to process what I'd experienced. Every instinct I'd developed as a journalist screamed that this was elaborate nonsense. Powerful people telling themselves comforting stories about their importance, dressing up their influence in mystical language to avoid confronting the mundane reality of politics and economics. But the metal disc had moved on its own. The forest had responded to the completion of their ritual, and the people involved weren't the kind who needed to invent elaborate fantasies to feel important. They already controlled most of the world's power and resources. Either I'd stumbled into the most sophisticated hoax in human history, or I'd been invited to document something that made every conspiracy theory I'd ever dismissed seem quaint by comparison. Tomorrow I'd get to see the archives. Tomorrow I'd learn whether Project Owl was an elaborate delusion or the most important secret in the world. Either way, my life as I knew it was over. I barely slept. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified. Branches creaking in the wind, night birds calling to each other, the distant murmur of late-night conversations from other camps. When I finally drifted off near dawn, my dreams were filled with spinning metal discs and watching eyes carved from stone. Eleanor found me at breakfast, appearing beside my table in the dining hall as if she'd materialised from thin air. In daylight, she looked like any other well-preserved socialite who might attend charity galas in Pacific Heights. The kind of woman whose presence at an all-male retreat would be explained as someone's eccentric aunt, who'd been grandfathered in through family connections. "Ready for the historical tour?" she asked, settling into the chair across from me. "Is that what we're calling it? The other guests think you're researching the Grove's role in American political history, which isn't entirely untrue." She sipped her coffee, eyes scanning the dining hall. "Most of them will be occupied with golf and lake activities today. Perfect time for a deeper education." We walked through the main camp area, past men reading newspapers and debating policy like they were at any expensive resort. Eleanor kept up a stream of casual conversation about Grove traditions and notable members, playing her part as tour guide. But I noticed she was leading us away from the popular areas, towards sections of the forest I hadn't seen before. "The Grove covers nearly 3,000 acres, she explained as we walked. "Most guests never venture beyond the central few hundred. Why would they? The camps, the lake, the dining facilities, everything they need for their retreat is concentrated in one area. But the rest of the property serves other purposes." We'd been walking for almost 20 minutes when she stopped beside what appeared to be a maintenance shed. Weathered wood siding, corrugated metal roof, the kind of utilitarian structure that becomes invisible once you've seen it. Eleanor produced a key and opened the padlock on the door. Inside, the shed was bigger than it appeared from outside, extending back into the hillside. What I'd taken for a simple storage building was actually a facade hiding a much larger underground facility. Fluorescent lights flickered on as we descended a concrete staircase that went down much deeper than should have been possible. "Built during the Cold War," Eleanor explained, her voice echoing in the narrow stairwell. "Officially, it's an emergency shelter for continuity of government operations. Unofficially, it houses the most complete archive of Project Owl materials outside of certain classified Pentagon files." The stairs ended at a steel door marked with radiation warnings and biohazard symbols. Eleanor placed her palm on a scanner that seemed decades newer than the rest of the facility. The door slid open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing something that took my breath away. The archive stretched out in all directions, a vast underground chamber carved from the bedrock beneath the grove. Metal shelving units reached toward a ceiling lost in shadows, each one packed with boxes, files, artifacts and equipment I couldn't begin to identify. Climate control systems hummed quietly, maintaining perfect temperature and humidity for materials that spanned nearly 8 decades of secret research. "Welcome to the real history of the 20th century, Eleanor said. She led me past shelves of documents in German, Russian, Chinese, and languages I didn't recognise. Maps marked with symbols similar to what I'd seen on the altar. Photographs of archaeological expeditions to remote locations around the world. Technical specifications for devices that looked like they belonged in science fiction movies. After we recovered the original Nazi materials in 1943, President Roosevelt authorised a classified research program," Eleanor explained, pulling a thick file from one of the shelves. "The scientists involved were initially sceptical. Einstein himself consulted on the project for 6 months before concluding that the artefacts operated according to principles beyond current physics." She opened the file, revealing handwritten notes in what I recognised as Einstein's distinctive script. Mathematical equations filled page after page, interspersed with frustrated observations about phenomena that violate fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. What did he conclude? That the universe is far stranger than we assumed, and that consciousness might play a more active role in physical processes than anyone wanted to admit. Eleanor closed the Einstein file and pulled out another one marked Tibet Expedition 1944 to 1947. We sent teams back to find the original source of the artefacts, learn how the binding process actually worked. The photographs in this file showed Western archaeologists working alongside Tibetan monks in monasteries that looked untouched by modernity. But what caught my attention were the images of stone chambers carved deep into mountain faces, filled with artefacts identical to what I'd seen the night before. "The monks weren't surprised to see us," Eleanor continued. "They'd been expecting someone to come asking questions about what the Germans had stolen. According to their records, this wasn't the first time the binding had been broken and had to be re-established. How many times? At least 7 documented instances over the past millennium. Each time, the disruption led to a period of sustained chaos. Wars, plagues, social collapse. The monks developed their containment techniques through trial and error over centuries. She showed me translation documents, painstakingly decoded texts that described rituals similar to what I'd witnessed, but far more complex. The Tibetan methods involved dozens of practitioners working in carefully coordinated groups, maintaining the binding through constant vigilance and regular reinforcement ceremonies. The Grove's founders didn't understand the underlying principles, Eleanor admitted. They just knew that gathering powerful, influential people together for focused ritual activities seemed to have a stabilising effect on certain phenomena. We moved deeper into the archive, past sections devoted to different decades of research. I saw files on the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam War, Watergate, the fall of the Berlin Wall, all marked with notations about containment stress and binding fluctuations. "Major historical events correlate with weaknesses in the containment," Eleanor explained. "Sometimes the stress is caused by the events themselves. Global conflicts generate the kind of chaos that feeds the entity. Sometimes it's the reverse. Containment failures create conditions that make conflicts more likely. Chicken and egg. Exactly. Which is why prevention became our focus rather than reaction." She stopped at a section of the archive devoted to technology development. Here were prototypes of devices that looked decades ahead of anything I'd seen in the outside world. Machines that supposedly measured spiritual resonance and metaphysical field fluctuations. Computer models attempting to quantify something that traditional science insisted didn't exist. "The hardest part has always been bridging the gap between ancient knowledge and modern capabilities," Eleanor said, picking up a device that looked like a cross between a spectrometer and a Geiger counter. The monks' techniques worked, but they required lifelong training and cultural conditions that don't exist in the modern world. We needed methods that could be implemented by people with day jobs and families. Hence the Grove. Annual gatherings of influential people, focused ritual activities, enough genuine belief and emotional investment to create the necessary resonance. She set down the device and looked at me seriously. "But it's a band-aid solution, and we all know it. The original binding required full-time practitioners working in optimal conditions. We're trying to maintain something incredibly complex and dangerous using part-time amateurs. We reached the centre of the archive, where a circular area had been cleared for what appeared to be a viewing room. Multiple monitors displayed real-time data streams, seismic readings, atmospheric measurements, and more esoteric graphs tracking things labelled psychic resonance and entity containment levels. "This is where we monitor the binding stability," Eleanor explained, settling into one of the chairs facing the displays. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The moment something starts to deteriorate, we know about it. I studied the screens, trying to make sense of the constantly shifting data. One monitor showed a map of the world with coloured dots marking locations where anomalous events had occurred in the past 24 hours. Another displayed what looked like seismic data, but with patterns that seemed too regular to be natural earthquakes. "What's the current status?" Eleanor's expression grew grave. "Declining. The binding has been weakening steadily for the past 15 years, accelerating in the past 5. We estimate maybe 2 to 3 years before complete failure becomes inevitable. What happens then? Unknown. The historical records from previous binding failures are incomplete. The monks who witnessed them were usually dead within months. But we can make educated guesses based on pattern analysis." She pulled up another screen, this one showing a timeline of major global events overlaid with containment stability measurements. The correlation was undeniable. Every period of significant chaos in human history corresponded with dramatic drops in whatever they were measuring. Complete binding failure would likely trigger cascading system collapses, Eleanor continued. Political institutions, economic markets, social structures, all the complex relationships that hold civilization together become vulnerable when certain types of influence are unchecked. "How bad are we talking?" "Best case scenario? A severe global recession coupled with widespread political instability, multiple government collapses, market crashes, social unrest spreading faster than any rational analysis would predict. And worst case?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying the data streams that painted an increasingly grim picture of whatever they were monitoring. Worst case is the end of human civilization as we know it. Not through nuclear war or climate change or any of the threats people talk about in public. Through something much more fundamental, the breakdown of the psychological and spiritual structures that allow complex societies to exist. She pulled up historical records from previous binding failures, translated accounts from Tibetan monasteries that had witnessed similar events centuries earlier. "The entity doesn't destroy through physical force," she explained. "It works through consciousness, through the collective human capacity for cooperation and rational thought. When the binding fails completely, people lose the ability to trust institutions, to believe in shared values, to work together toward common goals. Everything falls apart from within." I stared at the monitors, watching real-time measurements of something that supposedly determined the fate of human civilization. The graphs showed steady decline across multiple indicators, punctuated by sudden spikes that corresponded to major news events I recognized from recent headlines. This is why you needed an outside journalist, I realized. The inner circle is dying off, and you need someone to document the whole system before it's too late. Partly. But there's another reason. Eleanor turned to face me directly. "We think the traditional approach might be fundamentally flawed." "What do you mean?" "The Grove, the annual ceremonies, the networking among powerful elites. It all assumes that influence and authority are the same thing they were 50 years ago. But the world has changed. Real power increasingly lies with people who have no connection to traditional institutions." She pulled up another screen, this one showing social media analytics and internet traffic patterns. Modern influence is distributed, digital, and often anonymous. A teenager with a viral video can shape public opinion more effectively than a senator. Cryptocurrency traders can destabilize national currencies. Hackers can cripple infrastructure. The Grove model assumes that controlling government and corporate leaders gives you control over social stability. But it doesn't anymore. Exactly. Which means our containment strategy might be obsolete just when we need it most. Eleanor stood up, pacing between the monitors. "We need new approaches, new methods, new people involved in the binding process. But we also need someone on the outside who can document everything we've learned, preserve the institutional knowledge in case our transition efforts fail. You want me to write the ultimate conspiracy theory article. I want you to write the truth. All of it. The complete history of Project Owl, the scientific evidence for non-physical phenomena affecting global stability, the methods we've developed for managing existential threats that most people don't believe exist. She led me to another section of the archive, this one containing dozens of film reels stored in climate-controlled cases. But first, you need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. The Nazi expedition that started all this documented their activities extensively. They filmed everything, convinced they were making history. Eleanor selected one of the reels and loaded it into a vintage projector that looked like it belonged in a museum. The screen flickered to life, showing black and white footage of men in SS uniforms working in what appeared to be a Tibetan monastery. Tibet, 1943, Eleanor narrated as the images played. The Ahnenerbe expedition, led by Heinrich Himmler's personal occult research division. They found what they were looking for, but they had no idea what they were actually dealing with. The film showed German archaeologists carefully removing artifacts from hidden chambers, documenting everything with scientific precision. But as they worked, the footage began to show anomalies, shadows that moved independently of their sources, equipment malfunctioning in ways that defied explanation. And in the faces of the expedition members, a growing sense of unease that became terror as the film progressed. "Watch what happens when they break the original seal," Eleanor said. On screen, the Germans used explosives to breach a stone chamber that had clearly been sealed for centuries. The moment the barrier cracked, the camera recorded something that made my skin crawl, a sound like wind rushing through tunnels, but with an intelligence behind it that felt actively malevolent. The expedition members began arguing, then fighting, then turning on each other with a violence that seemed to come from nowhere. Within hours of breaking the seal, half the team was dead, and the survivors were fleeing through the mountains carrying only the most portable artifacts. "They thought they'd found weapons," Eleanor explained as the reel ended. What they actually found was something that used them as weapons against each other. The surviving members of the expedition spent the rest of the war trying to develop countermeasures, but it was too late. The damage was already spreading. She loaded another reel, this one showing American soldiers in 1945 investigating what remained of German occult research facilities. General Patton's intelligence units found the Nazi research archives during the final push into Germany. Most of it was dismissed as mystical nonsense, but a few people recognized the potential strategic implications. The second film showed American scientists examining the artifacts that would eventually end up at Bohemian Grove, testing them with instruments that clearly couldn't measure what they were really dealing with. But the effects were undeniable. Personnel exposed to the artifacts began exhibiting erratic behaviour, making increasingly irrational decisions, turning against colleagues and superiors without apparent cause. Project Owl was established to contain and study the artifacts while developing countermeasures, Eleanor continued. The Grove became the testing ground for large-scale containment techniques. And it worked. For almost 80 years, yes, but the binding requires constant maintenance, and each generation faces new challenges. She showed me more reels, documenting decades of research and development, scientists working to understand forces that couldn't be quantified, politicians unknowingly participating in rituals designed to maintain global stability, business leaders whose networking activities served purposes they never suspected. The most recent footage showed the Grove ceremonies I'd witnessed, but from multiple camera angles that revealed details invisible to casual observers. During the official cremation of care, sophisticated monitoring equipment tracked energy fluctuations that spiked dramatically during specific moments of the ritual. The hidden ceremony showed even more dramatic readings, with measurements that peaked exactly when the chanting reached its climax. The science isn't complete, Eleanor admitted. We're still working with phenomena that exist at the intersection of consciousness and physics, in areas where traditional materialist approaches break down. But the effects are measurable, reproducible, and absolutely critical for global stability. Why hasn't any of this been published? Because publication would destroy the effectiveness of the countermeasures. The binding works partly because the participants believe in what they're doing, even if they don't understand the underlying mechanisms. Widespread skepticism and debunking would undermine the psychological foundations that make the ritual effective. She gestured toward the monitors showing real-time containment data. But we're reaching a point where secrecy might be more dangerous than exposure. The traditional power structures that maintain the Grove system are fragmenting. New forms of influence are emerging faster than we can adapt, and the entity itself seems to be evolving, finding new ways to exploit modern communication systems and social networks. What are you asking me to do? Eleanor stopped the projector and faced me directly. Document everything. Learn how the system works, understand what's at stake, and prepare a complete record that can preserve this knowledge for future generations. Then help us figure out how to adapt these techniques for a world where power and influence operate according to completely different rules. And if I refuse? Then you'll have an interesting story about rich men performing rituals in the woods. You'll publish it, people will read it as entertainment, and the most important secret in human history will die with us. The monitors around us continued their steady tracking of forces I was only beginning to understand. Whatever they were measuring was declining steadily, and the implications of that decline were more terrifying than any conventional threat I could imagine. How long do I have to decide? The next phase of your education starts tonight, Eleanor said. We'll show you the complete film archive, introduce you to the current research team, and give you access to the real-time monitoring systems. After that, you'll understand exactly what's at stake. She began shutting down the projection equipment, preparing to leave the archive. But I should warn you, once you've seen everything, there's no going back. The knowledge becomes a responsibility, and that responsibility will follow you for the rest of your life. As we climbed back toward the surface, I tried to process what I'd learned. Either I'd stumbled into the most elaborate hoax in human history, or I was being invited to document something that made every conspiracy theory seem quaint by comparison. The shed above us looked innocent enough in the afternoon sunlight, just another maintenance building in a forest full of them. But beneath our feet lay evidence of forces that supposedly shaped the course of human civilization, monitored by people who carried the weight of secrets too dangerous for public consumption. Tomorrow night, I'd see the rest of the archive. Tomorrow night, I'd learn whether Project Owl represented humanity's greatest triumph or its most necessary deception. Either way, my life as I knew it was ending. The only question was what would replace it. Eleanor met me again at sunset, appearing beside my cabin as the dinner bell rang across the grove. Around us, members were gathering for the evening's entertainment, some kind of historical presentation about Grove traditions that would give us perfect cover for our real activities. Tonight you see everything, she said simply. The complete archive going back to the beginning. Fair warning, some of it isn't easy to watch. We took a different route to the underground facility, following maintenance paths that avoided the main camp areas. Eleanor moved with the confidence of someone who'd made this journey countless times, but I noticed she kept checking her watch with increasing frequency. Are we on a schedule? The containment readings have been fluctuating all day, she explained. Nothing critical yet, but we want to complete your education before the situation becomes complicated. The archive felt different at night. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows between the shelving units, and the climate control system seemed louder in the darkness above. Eleanor led me to a section I hadn't seen before, where dozens of film canisters were stored in temperature-controlled cases. Chronological order, she said, pulling out the first reel. Tibet, 1943. This is where it all started. The footage was better preserved than I'd expected, considering its age. German expedition members documented their activities with scientific precision, filming everything from arrival at the monastery to the careful cataloguing of artefacts they found in hidden chambers. But what struck me most was the change in the expedition members themselves as the film progressed. They started as confident researchers, convinced they were recovering important historical artefacts for the Reich. By the end, they were hollow-eyed and paranoid, jumping at shadows and arguing with increasing violence over trivial decisions. Watch the progression, Eleanor advised as she loaded the second reel. The deterioration follows a predictable pattern. She was right. The expedition leader, who appeared calm and competent in early footage, gradually became erratic and suspicious. He began seeing conspiracies among his own team members, making accusations that had no basis in reality. Other team members developed obsessive behaviours, repetitive actions that served no logical purpose, but which they couldn't seem to stop. The entity doesn't possess people in any dramatic sense, Eleanor explained. It influences them, amplifies existing psychological weaknesses, makes rational cooperation increasingly difficult. The later reels showed the aftermath. German scientists attempting to study the recovered artefacts, unaware that exposure to them was affecting their judgment and behaviour. Research that started as methodical investigation devolved into fractured efforts as team members became unable to work together effectively. By 1944, the Nazi research program was in complete disarray, Eleanor said, loading footage from American intelligence units, not because they lacked resources or expertise, but because the people involved had lost the capacity for organised, rational effort. The American footage was even more disturbing. Soldiers who'd participated in securing the German research facilities began exhibiting similar symptoms within weeks: paranoia, aggression, an inability to follow orders or work as a team. The artefacts were quickly transferred to secure facilities, but the damage was already spreading through the military units involved. This is when President Roosevelt authorised Project Owl, Eleanor said, showing me classified documents I definitely shouldn't have been seeing. The decision was made to contain the artefacts rather than study them, at least until we understood what we were dealing with. The next series of reels documented the early years of the Grove's involvement. Prominent businessmen and politicians who thought they were participating in elaborate team-building exercises, unaware that their activities were being carefully monitored for their effects on containment stability. The beautiful irony, Eleanor noted, is that the most effective participants were people who took the rituals seriously, without believing in their literal truth. They invested genuine emotional energy in symbolic activities, creating the psychological resonance necessary for containment without the skepticism that would undermine it. I watched decades of Grove ceremonies, seeing the evolution from crude early attempts to the sophisticated rituals I'd witnessed. The filmmakers documented everything from multiple angles, tracking correlations between participant behaviour and mysterious readings on monitoring equipment. The breakthrough came in 1963, Eleanor said, loading a reel marked Project Mindbridge Consciousness Research Initiative. We finally began to understand the relationship between collective human consciousness and what we were trying to contain. This footage showed scientists working with equipment that looked decades ahead of anything I'd seen in public research facilities. They were mapping what they called psychic resonance fields, measuring the effects of focused group attention on phenomena that traditional science insisted didn't exist. Consciousness isn't passive, Eleanor explained as the footage showed researchers monitoring brainwave patterns during Grove ceremonies. Under specific conditions, focused human attention can influence physical processes through mechanisms we still don't fully understand. The evidence was compelling. During successful binding rituals, monitoring equipment showed dramatic changes in local electromagnetic fields, gravitational anomalies, and other effects that defied conventional explanation. The more focused and emotionally invested the participants, the stronger the measured effects. But the most important discovery was that the entity itself is conscious, Eleanor continued, loading a reel from the 1970s. Not conscious like a human or animal, but aware in ways that allow it to adapt and respond to our containment efforts. This footage was harder to watch. It showed experiments where researchers deliberately weakened containment protocols to study the entity's responses. The results were horrifying. Within hours, people exposed to the weakened binding began turning on each other with a savagery that had no rational explanation. We learned that it doesn't just influence behaviour randomly, Eleanor said. It targets the specific psychological and social bonds that hold groups together. It makes people distrust authority, question shared values, abandon cooperation in favour of individual survival. The final series of reels brought the documentation up to the present day. Recent Grove ceremonies filmed with modern digital equipment, showing measurements that painted an increasingly dire picture. The binding was weakening despite their best efforts, and the entity's influence was spreading through channels they were still struggling to understand. Internet culture, social media, digital communication. They've created new vectors for the kind of psychological influence the entity specialises in, Eleanor explained. People are more isolated, more suspicious, more prone to conspiracy thinking than ever before. The very technologies that connect us globally are making us more vulnerable to forces that exploit human psychological weaknesses. She showed me correlation analyses that were truly frightening. Every major spike in online harassment, political extremism, and social division corresponded with measured fluctuations in containment stability. The entity wasn't just confined to the physical artifacts anymore. It was spreading through digital networks, using human communication systems to amplify its influence. This is why traditional approaches aren't working, Eleanor said. The Grove model assumes that controlling physical locations and influential people gives you control over social stability. But in a networked world, influence operates according to completely different rules. The most recent footage showed research teams working on new approaches, attempts to create digital containment protocols, online rituals that could engage globally distributed participants, technological methods for monitoring and countering the entity's influence through internet channels. The preliminary results are promising, Eleanor admitted, but we're running out of time. The traditional binding is failing faster than we can develop alternatives. She turned off the projection equipment and faced me directly. That's the complete record. 80 years of research containment and gradual understanding of something that exists at the intersection of consciousness and physics. Now, you understand what we're really dealing with. I sat in silence for several minutes trying to process what I'd seen. The footage was too detailed, too consistent, too well documented to be an elaborate hoax. But accepting it as real meant accepting that everything I thought I knew about how the world worked was fundamentally incomplete. What do you need from me? Help us bridge the gap between old knowledge and new realities, Eleanor said. Document everything we've learned, but also help us figure out how to adapt these techniques for a world where influence operates through social media and digital networks rather than exclusive clubs and private meetings. I'm a journalist, not a researcher. You're someone who understands how information spreads in the modern world, how narratives form and evolve, how public opinion gets shaped by forces most people never notice. Those are exactly the skills we need. She gestured toward the monitors showing real-time containment data. The entity is learning to use our own communication systems against us. We need people who understand those systems well enough to develop countermeasures. And if we fail, Eleanor's expression grew grave. Then within the next few years, human civilization enters a period of chaos and collapse, unlike anything in recorded history. Not through war or natural disaster, but through the breakdown of the psychological foundations that make complex societies possible. The weight of what she was telling me settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. If they were right, I wasn't just being offered the story of a lifetime, I was being recruited to help prevent the end of the world as we knew it. When do we start? Tomorrow, Eleanor said. But first, you need to see what happens when containment fails. We have one more reel to show you. Footage from 1962, when a test of weakened binding protocols got out of hand. She loaded the final reel, and I watched something that would haunt my dreams for years to come. Research subjects exposed to deliberately weakened containment turned on each other with a ferocity that looked less like human behaviour than like animals driven mad by disease. Within hours, rational people became incapable of basic cooperation, seeing enemies everywhere, responding to imagined threats with real violence. Multiply that by global population, Eleanor said quietly, and you begin to understand what we're trying to prevent. As we climbed back toward the surface, I realised there was no going back. Whether Project Owl represented the most important secret in human history, or the most elaborate delusion ever created, I was now part of it. The knowledge had become a responsibility, and that responsibility would shape everything I did for the rest of my life. Above us, the Grove continued its normal activities. Powerful people, networking and bonding, unaware that their casual retreats served a purpose that might determine the survival of human civilization. Tomorrow I'd begin learning how to help them succeed. I woke before dawn to the sound of helicopters, not the distant drone of aircraft passing over, but the heavy thrum of rotors directly overhead, circling the grove in patterns that suggested search rather than transport. Eleanor appeared at my cabin door before I'd finished dressing, her usual composed demeanour replaced by urgent tension. "We have a problem," she said simply. "Someone's been monitoring our activities." She led me quickly through the forest, avoiding the main paths and staying under tree cover that would hide us from aerial observation. "The helicopters were government aircraft," she explained, "but not ones under Project Owl's control. Different agencies have different levels of clearance," she said as we moved. "Some know about our activities, some know only pieces, and some know nothing but suspect something significant is happening here. Which category do the helicopters represent? The dangerous one. People who know enough to be suspicious but not enough to understand the consequences of interference." We reached the concealed entrance to the archive facility, but Eleanor didn't lead me inside. Instead, she continued deeper into the forest, towards sections of the grove I'd never seen. "The underground facility is compromised," she explained. "Motion sensors, thermal imaging, electromagnetic monitoring. Anyone with the right equipment can detect activity below ground. We need to show you the backup systems." After 20 minutes of hiking through increasingly dense forest, we reached what appeared to be a natural clearing dominated by a single massive redwood. Eleanor approached the tree and pressed her hand against a section of bark that looked identical to every other section. A hidden panel slid aside, revealing modern electronic equipment built directly into the living wood. "Emergency monitoring station," she said, activating screens that showed the same real-time data I'd seen in the underground archive. "If the main facility's compromised, we can still track containment stability from here." The readings were worse than anything I'd seen before. Multiple indicators showed rapid deterioration, with fluctuations that spiked dramatically every time the helicopters passed overhead. "Electromagnetic interference," Eleanor explained. "The aircraft are disrupting the resonance fields that maintain the binding. They don't know what they're doing, but the effect is cumulative." As if summoned by her words, one of the helicopters passed directly overhead, and the monitoring equipment registered a spike that made Eleanor curse under her breath. "We need to evacuate the sensitive materials," she said, beginning to shut down the equipment. "The original artifacts, the most critical research data, anything that can't be replaced." "Where?" "Secondary sites." We learned decades ago never to keep everything in one location. She finished securing the monitoring station and led me back toward the main camp. "But first, we need to get you away from here. If this goes wrong, you're the only person outside the project who knows the complete truth." We were halfway back to my cabin when the shooting started. Not gunfire, something else. The sharp crack of what sounded like electrical discharges. Through the trees, I could see flashes of light that had nothing to do with the helicopters overhead. "What is that?" Eleanor grabbed my arm, pulling me behind the massive trunk of an ancient redwood. "Containment failure. The electromagnetic interference pushed the binding past critical thresholds." The flashes were coming from the direction of the sacred grove, where the official ceremonies took place. But these weren't artificial lights. They looked like lightning, but moving in patterns that defied any natural explanation. "The entity is breaking through," Eleanor said, checking her watch with obvious anxiety. "Localized manifestation, probably limited to the immediate area, but we need to implement emergency protocols immediately." "What kind of emergency protocols?" Before she could answer, a man appeared through the trees, one of the Grove members I'd seen at the dining hall, but changed in ways that made my skin crawl. His face was twisted with rage that seemed to come from nowhere, and he was carrying what appeared to be a broken tree branch like a weapon. "You?" he said, focusing on Eleanor with hatred that was obviously irrational. You're the one who's been lying to us." Eleanor stepped back, keeping the tree trunk between herself and the approaching man. "George, you need to get back to your cabin. You're not thinking clearly." "Thinking perfectly clearly for the first time in years," George replied, raising the makeshift weapon. "Seeing through all the lies, all the manipulation. You people think you can control us, think you can use us for your games." He swung the branch at Eleanor's head with murderous intent. She dodged, but barely, and I realised with growing horror that we were seeing the entity's influence in real time. George wasn't just angry. He was completely detached from normal human empathy and reason. "This is what happens when containment fails," Eleanor said quietly, pulling me deeper into the forest. "People lose the capacity for rational cooperation. They see enemies everywhere, respond to imagined threats with real violence." Behind us, George was joined by others, Grove members who transformed from networking politicians and businessmen into something that barely resembled human beings. They moved with pack mentality, communicating through gestures and sounds that suggested intelligence but not consciousness as I understood it. How do we stop it? "Emergency binding ritual," Eleanor said, leading me toward another concealed facility. "But it requires specific people in specific locations, and we're running out of time." The facility she brought me to was smaller than the main archive, but clearly designed for crisis situations. Emergency supplies, backup communication equipment, and most importantly, a collection of artifacts identical to the ones I'd seen in the underground chamber. "Portable containment kit," Eleanor explained, gathering materials with practiced efficiency. "The ritual can be performed anywhere, but it's less stable than the permanent installation." She handed me a metal disc covered with the same spiralling symbols I'd seen before, but this one felt warm to the touch and seemed to vibrate with energy I couldn't identify. "Hold this and think calming thoughts," she instructed. "Visualize peace, cooperation, people working together toward common goals. The binding responds to consciousness, but it requires focused intention from multiple participants." "I don't know how to do this." "You don't need training, you need belief. The entity feeds on conflict and suspicion. The binding requires the opposite: trust, cooperation, shared purpose." As she spoke, the sounds from outside grew worse. More Grove members had joined the pack hunting us, but their behaviour was becoming less and less human. They were making sounds that reminded me of wolves or wild dogs, communicating through methods that bypassed language entirely. "They're not possessed," Eleanor explained, setting up equipment that looked like a cross between a radio and a meditation altar. "They're influenced. The entity amplifies existing psychological weaknesses, selfishness, paranoia, aggression, until rational cooperation becomes impossible." "How long does it last?" "Without intervention, permanent. The changes become self-reinforcing, creating a cycle of escalating conflict that spreads to anyone exposed to the affected individuals." She activated the emergency equipment, and I felt the disc in my hands grow warmer. Around us, the air seemed to thicken, taking on the quality of electrical charge that precedes thunderstorms. "Now," Eleanor said, "focus on everything that makes human civilization possible. Trust between strangers, cooperation across differences, the willingness to sacrifice individual advantage for collective benefit." I tried to do what she asked, but the sounds outside made concentration nearly impossible. The hunting pack had found our location and was circling the facility, testing for weak points with animal cunning. "It's not working," I said. "It needs more participants," Eleanor admitted. "The emergency protocol requires at least 7 people working in coordination. I was hoping we could manage with 2, but the interference is too strong." As if responding to her words, the attackers began trying to break down the door, but their methods were wrong somehow. They were using tactics that might work against prey animals, but not against humans who understood tools and leverage. "Their intelligence is being affected," Eleanor observed. "They're losing abstract reasoning, reverting to more primitive cognitive patterns. Is that good or bad for us?" "Both. They can't plan sophisticated attacks, but they also can't be reasoned with or distracted." The door was beginning to buckle under coordinated assault. Within minutes they'd break through, and I had no illusions about what would happen then. The people outside might once have been politicians and businessmen, but they'd become something that saw us as threats to be eliminated. Eleanor made a decision that probably saved our lives. "Run," she said, gathering the most essential artifacts into a backpack. "There's a service road 2 miles north of here. Follow it east until you reach Highway 101, then go south to San Francisco. What about you?" "I'll try to implement the emergency protocol with whatever Grove members are still unaffected. But you need to get this information to the outside world." She handed me a small device that looked like an ordinary cell phone but felt heavier than it should. "Encrypted satellite communicator," she explained. "Speed dial 1 connects you to our backup facility in Colorado. Tell them what happened here and give them your location. They'll arrange extraction and debriefing." The door gave way just as we climbed out through a concealed rear exit. I heard Eleanor shouting something that sounded like Latin, saw flashes of light that suggested she was attempting some kind of emergency ritual, but I was already running through the forest as fast as the terrain would allow. Behind me the sounds of conflict grew worse, not just the pack that had been hunting us, but what sounded like warfare spreading throughout the grove. The entity's influence was expanding, affecting more and more people, creating a feedback loop of violence that would keep escalating until someone found a way to stop it. I ran for over an hour, following game trails and maintenance paths that led generally north. Twice I heard helicopters overhead, but I couldn't tell if they were still part of the problem or part of some attempted solution. The encrypted communicator remained silent. Either the backup facility was out of range, or something had happened to it as well. The service road, when I finally found it, was blocked by abandoned vehicles. Grove security guards had apparently fled their posts, leaving gates open and equipment scattered. Whatever had happened here was bigger than just the immediate area around the sacred grove. I followed the road east on foot, staying off the asphalt to avoid being visible from the air. The communicator finally picked up a signal as I reached higher ground, but when I activated speed dial 1, the response wasn't what I had expected. "Project Owl emergency line," a voice said. "State your clearance level and location." "I don't have a clearance level," I said. "Eleanor Hartwell gave me this device. There's been a containment failure at Bohemian Grove." A pause, then. "Are you the journalist?" "Yes." "We've been expecting your call. What's your current location?" I described my position as best I could, and the voice gave me coordinates for a pickup point 5 miles south of my position. "Emergency extraction team is en route," the voice said. "ETA 40 minutes. Stay hidden until you see a black helicopter with owl markings." "What happened to Eleanor?" Another pause, longer this time. "Unknown. We lost contact with all Grove personnel 3 hours ago. You may be the only survivor with first-hand knowledge of the incident." The call ended, leaving me alone on a forest road with the weight of impossible knowledge. If Eleanor was right, I'd just witnessed the beginning of something that could destroy human civilization. If she was wrong, I'd been recruited into the most elaborate delusion in history. Either way, there was no going back. The story I'd come to investigate had become my life, and that life would never be the same. The helicopter that picked me up wasn't military, but it wasn't civilian either. Black, unmarked, with sound dampening that made it whisper rather than roar. The pilot didn't speak during the 40-minute flight south, and the windows were tinted too dark to see our destination until we landed. The facility looked like a corporate retreat centre, modern architecture nestled in rolling hills, solar panels and native landscaping that suggested environmental consciousness rather than government secrecy. Only the subtle security measures revealed its true nature. Sensors disguised as decorative elements, barriers that looked like artistic features, multiple escape routes hidden as walking paths. Eleanor was waiting for me in the lobby. She looked exhausted but uninjured, wearing clean clothes that suggested she'd arrived well before me. Relief flooded through me at seeing her alive, followed immediately by suspicion about how she'd gotten here so quickly. "You made it," she said, embracing me with what felt like genuine emotion. "I wasn't sure you would." "How are you here?" "I thought you were trapped at the Grove." "Emergency protocols," she explained, leading me toward a conference room. "The moment containment failed, automated systems began evacuating key personnel and sensitive materials. I was out within minutes of your escape." The conference room contained a dozen people I'd never seen before, all of them studying multiple screens showing data feeds from Bohemian Grove. The footage was disturbing. Grove members moving in coordinated packs, exhibiting behaviour that looked less human with each passing hour. "Situation report," said a woman who appeared to be in charge, younger than Eleanor, with the bearing of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "Complete local containment failure," Eleanor replied. "The electromagnetic interference from unauthorised surveillance pushed binding stability past critical thresholds. The entity achieved localised manifestation and began directly influencing exposed personnel. Casualties? Unknown. Approximately 200 Grove members were on site when the failure occurred." Current status of affected individuals is unclear, but behavioural modification appears to be progressing according to predicted patterns. I watched the screens showing real-time footage from the grove, trying to process what I was seeing. The people in the images moved with animal coordination, but their actions showed planning and intelligence that suggested they weren't completely reduced to primitive instincts. "They're organising," I observed. "Exactly," said the woman in charge. "The entity doesn't just cause chaos, it creates new forms of order based on conflict and dominance rather than cooperation and trust. Left unchecked, the affected population will form a functional society, but one dedicated to spreading their condition to others." "How?" Eleanor pulled up additional screens showing modelling predictions. "Physical contact isn't required. Extended exposure to affected individuals gradually influences behaviour in others. The process is slower than direct manifestation, but it's cumulative and irreversible without intervention." "What kind of intervention?" "That's what we need to decide," the woman in charge said. "We have 3 options, none of them good." She activated a presentation that laid out scenarios with clinical precision. Option 1, military containment. Seal off the affected area. Prevent anyone from leaving. Wait for the situation to stabilise. The affected population would eventually die off, but we'd lose any chance of understanding how the entity adapted to modern conditions. Option 2, aggressive binding ritual. Deploy our full capabilities to re-establish containment, potentially reversing the effects on affected individuals. High probability of success, but it would require resources that might be needed for future emergencies. Option 3, strategic documentation. Allow the situation to develop while recording everything, learning how the entity operates in uncontrolled conditions. Massive risk of spread, but invaluable data for developing long-term countermeasures. The weight of what they were asking settled on me like a physical presence. These weren't abstract policy decisions. They were choices about the lives of people I'd shared meals with, conversations with, casual moments of human connection that now seemed impossibly precious. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "That depends on you," Eleanor said. "You're the only person who witnessed the complete sequence of events, the only outsider who understands what's really at stake. Your perspective could determine which approach we take." I studied the screens showing real-time surveillance of the grove. The affected members were building something, crude structures that served purposes I couldn't identify, but which suggested they retained enough intelligence to plan and execute complex projects. They're not just reverting to primitive behaviour, I realised. They're creating something new. "Exactly," Eleanor confirmed. "The entity doesn't destroy civilization. It transforms it into something that serves its purposes rather than human ones. And if this spreads beyond the grove..." "Modelling suggests a tipping point around 10,000 affected individuals," the woman in charge said. "Beyond that, containment becomes impossible. The entity achieves critical mass and begins reshaping human civilization according to its own principles." I stared at the screens, watching people who'd once controlled vast resources and wielded enormous influence reduced to something that resembled humanity, but fundamentally wasn't. The choice they were asking me to make would determine not just the fate of those individuals, but potentially the future of human civilization itself. "How long do we have to decide?" "Hours," Eleanor said grimly. "The affected population is already attempting to breach the grove's perimeter. Once they reach populated areas, the window for containment closes permanently." As if summoned by her words, alarms began sounding throughout the facility. On the screens, we watched Grove members systematically dismantling the barriers that had kept them isolated from the outside world. They moved with coordinated purpose, using tools and techniques that suggested retained intelligence despite their transformed state. "They're adapting faster than our models predicted," the woman in charge observed. "The entity is learning from direct interaction with modern infrastructure." I made my decision. "Option 2, I said. "Full binding ritual. Try to save them." Eleanor nodded grimly. "It'll require everything we have. If we fail, there won't be resources left for future containment efforts. And if we do nothing, there won't be a future to contain." The next 6 hours passed in a blur of coordinated activity. Teams deployed to locations around the grove, carrying artifacts and equipment I was only beginning to understand. The binding ritual required precise positioning, perfect timing, and absolute faith in principles that defied everything I'd learned about how the world worked. But it worked. I watched on screens as the coordinated behaviour of the affected Grove members gradually became confused, then chaotic, then slowly returned to something recognisably human. The transformation took hours, but by dawn rescue teams were extracting survivors who remembered nothing of their transformed state but everything of their normal lives. The official story, when it emerged, blamed a gas leak for temporary behavioural effects among Grove attendees. A few conspiracy theorists suggested government mind control experiments, but without hard evidence, their theories joined the usual background noise of speculation about elite gatherings. 6 months later, I sit in my apartment staring at a hard drive containing the complete documentation of Project Owl. Video footage, research data, historical records, and testimony from dozens of participants spanning 8 decades of secret work to maintain global stability. The binding held. The Grove members recovered completely, with no memory of their transformation. The immediate crisis passed, and the world continued its normal pattern of manageable chaos and incremental progress. But the monitoring data tells a different story. The entity learned from its brief manifestation. Each subsequent containment requires more resources, more participants, more sophisticated countermeasures. The traditional approaches that worked for decades are becoming less effective with each passing year. Eleanor calls weekly with updates from facilities I'm not supposed to know exist. Teams working on digital containment protocols, researchers developing new methods for managing consciousness-based phenomena, analysts tracking the entity's adaptation to modern communication networks. They're making progress, but the race is getting closer. My phone buzzes with news alerts. Political assassinations in 3 countries, simultaneous market crashes that defy economic analysis, social unrest spreading through digital networks faster than anyone can track. Each event correlates with fluctuations in containment stability, signs that the old binding is weakening despite our best efforts. I have a choice to make. The hard drive contains everything needed to preserve Project Owl's institutional knowledge. Published as fiction, it would ensure the information survives, even if the current organisation fails. Presented as investigative journalism, it might mobilise resources for developing new containment methods. But publication might also undermine the psychological foundations that make the binding effective. Widespread skepticism could destroy the very mechanisms that have protected human civilization for 80 years. My cursor hovers over the upload button for a secure server that would distribute the complete files to journalists worldwide. With one click, I could expose the most important secret in human history. Or I could delete everything and trust that the people carrying this burden know what they're doing. Outside my window, the city continues its normal rhythm of traffic and commerce. Millions of people living their lives unaware that the stability they take for granted depends on secrets, too dangerous for public consumption. They don't know that their capacity for trust, cooperation and rational discourse is maintained by forces that most would dismiss as impossible. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some truths are too important to share. I close the laptop without making a decision, knowing I'll face the same choice tomorrow and the day after, and every day until either the binding holds permanently or everything falls apart. The hard drive sits on my desk like a loaded weapon, containing information that could save the world or destroy it, depending on how it's used. In the forest north of San Francisco, ancient redwoods continue their patient growth, sheltering secrets that predate human civilization. Beneath their roots, monitoring equipment tracks forces that exist at the intersection of consciousness and physics, measuring phenomena that determine whether humanity remains capable of the cooperation and trust that make complex societies possible. The owl watches and waits, neither good nor evil, but something far more dangerous. A force of pure change that cares nothing for human hopes or fears. And somewhere in the darkness between sleeping and waking, it grows stronger. Maybe they weren't hiding power. Maybe they were hiding what power keeps at bay. But how long can any cage hold something that learns from every attempt to contain it? I guess we'll find out.